Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Marcus Frostborn and I've been a ranger at Denali National Park for 18 years. I've seen every kind of weather this mountain can throw at you, pulled frozen climbers out of crevasses, and talked city folks out of hiking in blizzards wearing sneakers. I thought I'd seen everything Alaska had to offer. I was wrong. It was January 15th, 1982, when the call came in. I was sitting in the ranger station at Wonder Lake, sipping coffee and watching the snow fall outside. The radio crackled to life. Base to Ranger, Frostborn. We've got a situation. I grabbed the radio. This is Frostborn. What's the problem? International climbing team went missing 3 days ago. 7 climbers from Germany, Japan, and Canada. They were attempting a winter summit of McKinley. I frowned. Winter climbs were dangerous, but these guys were supposed to be experts. Any distress signals? That's the weird part. Their emergency beacon went off yesterday at 19,000 feet. Signal lasted about 10 minutes, then just stopped. I looked out at the mountain. McKinley rose up like a white giant against the gray sky, its peak hidden in clouds. The temperature was negative 47 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was howling like a pack of wolves. Weather window opens tomorrow morning, the voice continued. We need you to fly up there and check their last known position. I'd done dozens of rescue missions, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way the wind sounded that night, or how the local Athabascan guides had been acting strange all week, talking in hushed voices about old spirits waking up. Roger that, I said. I'll prep for first light. I spent the evening getting my gear ready. My old Air Force training kicked in. Check everything twice, pack for the worst, hope for the best. I loaded my backpack with extra batteries for my radio, emergency flares, medical supplies, and enough food for 3 days. My Motorola HT200 radio got a fresh battery check, and I made sure my Silva compass was working perfectly. The local weather station reported something I'd never seen before. Pockets of extreme cold moving across the mountain like living things. Temperatures dropping to near absolute zero, then warming up again for no reason anyone could explain. Probably equipment malfunction, I told myself, but I packed extra heat packs anyway. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside sounded different, like voices calling from a great distance. I kept thinking about what old Charlie Yazzie, one of the Athabascan elders, had told me a few weeks ago. Mountain's been restless lately, he'd said, his weathered face serious. Old guardians are stirring. You be careful up there, Marcus. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. I'd laughed it off then. Charlie was always talking about spirits and ancient legends. As far as I was concerned, the Inuit stories about ice giants were just ways to explain avalanches and weird weather patterns. But lying there in the dark, listening to that strange wind, I wasn't laughing anymore. The helicopter picked me up at dawn. The pilot, Jenny Morrison, had been flying in Alaska for 20 years. If anyone could get me up there safely, it was her. Strangest weather patterns I've ever seen, she said as we lifted off. Radio's been picking up interference all morning. Sounds almost like singing. I checked my equipment one more time as we flew toward the mountain. Below us, the frozen landscape stretched out like another planet. Everything was white and blue and deadly beautiful. There, Jenny said, pointing ahead. Base camp. I could see it through the helicopter window, a cluster of orange tents in a small clearing at about 14,000 feet. But something was wrong. The tents were torn apart, shredded like something had attacked them from the inside. Can you get me down there? I asked. Jenny nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I can give you 20 minutes before the next storm front moves in. After that, you're on your own until tomorrow. As we descended, I got my first look at what was left of the camp. It was bad. Gear was scattered everywhere, some of it thrown impossible distances across the snow. Sleeping bags were frozen solid and ripped to pieces. And then I saw the tracks. The helicopter set me down about 50 yards from the destroyed camp. The rotors kicked up a cloud of snow, and when it settled, Jenny gave me a thumbs up. 20 minutes, she shouted over the engine noise. "Then I'm gone, whether you're ready or not." I waved and watched her lift off. The sound of the helicopter faded quickly, swallowed by the wind and the vast silence of the mountain. Suddenly, I was alone with whatever had happened here. I walked toward the camp, and that's when I got my first real look at the tracks. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Each footprint was about 2 feet long and 8 inches wide, pressed deep into the snow like whatever made them weighed 1,000 pounds. The stride length was impossible, 12 feet between steps. No human could walk like that. I knelt down and measured one print with my hand. The toes were clearly defined, but there were only 4 of them, and they ended in what looked like claw marks. "What the hell?" I muttered, taking out my camera to document everything. The trail of prints led from the destroyed camp toward a series of ice caves about a quarter-mile up the slope. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the blood. There was a lot of it, frozen in dark red puddles around the campsite. But here's what didn't make sense. The blood trail didn't stop at the caves. It went up the mountain, straight up a vertical cliff face that would be impossible for a human to climb, even with ropes. I followed the tracks as far as I could, documenting everything. My radio crackled with static, and I tried to call in my findings. "Base, this is Frostborn. The camp is destroyed. Multiple casualties likely." Nothing but static answered me. "Base, do you copy?" More static, but underneath it, I could swear I heard something else. Voices, maybe, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded old, like words carved from ice. I checked my radio. The battery was full, and all the connections looked good. But every time I tried to transmit, the strange interference got louder. That's when I found the first body. Heinrich Müller, the German team leader, was about 100 yards from camp. At first glance, he looked like he'd just sat down to rest. His expression was peaceful, almost serene, but when I got closer, I saw the truth. He was frozen solid, turned into a statue of ice and flesh. His eyes were wide open, staring at something I couldn't see. Frost covered his face like a delicate spiderweb. The weird thing was his body temperature. I had an infrared thermometer in my kit, and when I pointed it at him, it read -200 degrees Fahrenheit. That was impossible. The air temperature was cold, but not that cold. Nothing in nature could freeze a human body to that temperature in the open air. I was still puzzling over this when I heard the sound. It came from the direction of the ice caves, a low, rumbling noise like a glacier breaking apart. But underneath that, I heard something else, something that sounded like breathing, but huge, like the mountain itself was taking slow, deep breaths. I looked at my watch. 15 minutes until Jenny came back. I should have waited by the landing zone. Any reasonable person would have waited. But I was a ranger, and there might be survivors up there in those caves. I couldn't just leave without checking. I started climbing toward the caves, following the blood trail and those impossible footprints. The wind picked up as I climbed, and the temperature began dropping fast. My breath came out in white puffs that froze before they hit the ground. The interference on my radio got worse. Instead of static, I was now hearing what sounded like chanting in some ancient language. The voices seemed to come from inside the mountain itself. I reached the entrance to the first cave and peered inside. It was dark, but I could see something moving in the shadows, something big. "Hello," I called out. "This is Park Service. Is anyone in there?" The movement stopped. Everything went silent except for the wind. Then I heard it, a voice answering me from deep inside the cave. But it wasn't speaking English or German or Japanese. It was speaking in the same ancient language I'd been hearing on the radio, and somehow, impossibly, I understood every word. "You should not have come here," the voice said. "This place is not for your kind." I backed away from the cave entrance, my heart pounding. That was when I saw the second set of tracks leading away from the caves. These were fresh, made within the last hour, and they were heading straight for my helicopter landing zone. I ran. I made it back to the landing zone just as Jenny's helicopter appeared over the ridge. But something was wrong. The aircraft was wobbling, fighting against wind that shouldn't have been there. My radio crackled to life. "Marcus," Jenny's voice was strained with panic. "I'm getting some kind of weird downdraft here. Temperature readings are going crazy." I looked around the landing zone and felt my blood go cold. The fresh tracks I'd been following ended right here, in a perfect circle around where the helicopter would land. "Jenny, abort the landing," I shouted into my radio. "Something's wrong down here." But it was too late. The helicopter was already descending, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the snow, but there was nothing above us to cast it. The shadow was huge, maybe 20 feet long, and it was moving toward the helicopter. The temperature dropped so fast I could see ice crystals forming in the air around me. My radio began making that strange chanting sound again, louder now, like dozens of voices singing in harmony. Jenny's helicopter touched down, and the rotors began to slow. She was looking at her instruments, confusion clear on her face even through the windscreen. "Temp gauge is reading -200 degrees Fahrenheit," she said over the radio. "That can't be right. The heating systems are going crazy." That's when the thing showed itself. It rose up from behind a wall of snow, like something out of a nightmare. 15 feet tall, maybe more, with skin like blue ice and eyes that glowed with cold fire. Its breath came out in white clouds that turned to snow crystals before hitting the ground. Jenny saw it through the helicopter windscreen and screamed. The creature reached toward the aircraft with one massive hand, and where it touched the metal, ice began spreading across the fuselage like a living thing. "Get out!" I yelled, running toward the helicopter. "Jenny, get out now!" But she was frozen with terror, staring up at the thing that couldn't possibly exist. The creature's breath hit the helicopter's windscreen, and the glass instantly became opaque with frost. The engine began to sputter and die as the fuel lines froze solid. I reached the aircraft just as Jenny finally snapped out of her shock and threw open the door. She stumbled out, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the helicopter. "What is that thing?" she gasped, her breath coming out in white puffs. "I don't know," I said, "but we need to move, now." The creature turned toward us, and when its eyes met mine, I heard its voice again inside my head. "You have trespassed in our domain," it said. "You have disturbed the eternal sleep. Now you must pay the price." I pulled out one of my emergency flares and lit it. The bright red flame seemed to give the creature pause, and it took a step backward. "The caves," I told Jenny. "We need to get to shelter." We ran toward the ice caves, and behind us, I could hear the creature's footsteps in the snow. Each step made the ground shake like a small earthquake. We made it to the cave entrance, just as my radio came alive with a new voice. "Marcus, this is Jake Wolverton. I'm about 10 minutes out on a snowmobile. What's your situation?" Jake was another ranger, a good friend who'd volunteered to provide backup when the weather window opened up. "Jake, stay away," I shouted into the radio. "There's something up here, something dangerous." But the radio was filled with static again, and I didn't know if he'd heard me. Jenny and I huddled in the cave entrance, and I kept the flare burning. The creature stood about 50 yards away, watching us with those horrible glowing eyes. "It's waiting for something," Jenny whispered. That's when we heard the sound of Jake's snowmobile echoing across the snow. The creature turned toward the sound and began walking in that direction, moving with impossible grace across the frozen ground. "Jake, don't come up here." I tried the radio again. "Jake, do you copy?" Nothing but that strange chanting. We watched helplessly as the creature disappeared over a ridge, heading straight for where Jake would be coming up the mountain. A few minutes later, we heard Jake's scream carrying across the wind. Then, everything went silent. I tried the radio one more time. "Jake? Jake, respond." Nothing. "We have to help him," Jenny said. I looked at the flare in my hand. It was already half burned down. With what? That thing just killed a man, and all I've got are some road flares and a broken radio. That's when we heard voices from deeper inside the cave. Human voices, speaking in English. "Help us," someone called weakly. "Please, we're trapped back here." Jenny and I looked at each other. The surviving climbers were still alive. But going deeper into the cave meant leaving our only source of light and heat, and moving into the domain of whatever these creatures were. "We have to try," Jenny said. I nodded and led the way into the darkness, my flare casting dancing shadows on the ice walls around us. We were about to discover that one monster was only the beginning. Deep in the ice cave, we found them. 4 members of the climbing team, huddled together in a small chamber about the size of a closet. They were alive, but barely. Hypothermic, frostbitten, and scared out of their minds. "How long have you been down here?" I asked, kneeling beside Yuki Tanaka, the Japanese team member who seemed to be in the best shape. 3 days, she whispered through chattering teeth. "Ever since they came. The Ice Walkers," said Klaus, one of the German climbers. That's what the Sherpa called them before. He couldn't finish the sentence. I helped them sit up and gave them some of my emergency heat packs. How many are there? We've seen 3 different ones, Yuki said. But there might be more. They move through the ice like it's water. They can walk up walls, appear and disappear. And when they touch you, she held up her left hand. 2 of her fingers were black with frostbite, but not the normal kind. This looked like they'd been dipped in liquid nitrogen. One of them just barely brushed against me, she explained. If it had grabbed me. Jenny was checking on the other survivors. This one's in bad shape, she said, pointing to a Canadian climber named David. He's got severe hypothermia. We need to get him to a hospital soon, or he's not going to make it. That's when we heard the sound from deeper in the cave system. Not the chanting this time, but something worse. The sound of ice cracking and reshaping itself, like the whole mountain was moving. They're coming back, Klaus whispered. I looked at my flare. It was almost burned out, and I only had 2 more. Is there another way out of here? Yuki shook her head. We've explored every tunnel. This chamber is a dead end. The only way out is the way we came. The sound was getting closer now, and with it came a cold that made the air itself feel thick and hard to breathe. Listen to me, I said to the group. I'm going to go out there and distract them. When I do, you take the survivors and head for the entrance. Don't stop, don't look back. You'll be killed, Jenny protested. Maybe. But if we all stay here, we're all dead anyway. I lit my second flare and started walking deeper into the cave, toward the sounds. Behind me, I could hear Jenny helping the survivors get ready to move. The tunnel opened up into a huge chamber, bigger than a cathedral. The walls were covered in ice that seemed to glow with its own light. And standing in the center of the chamber was the largest of the ice walkers. This one was 18 feet tall, with features that looked almost human but stretched and twisted like a reflection in broken glass. Its skin was clear as crystal, and I could see something moving underneath. Veins of pure cold, flowing like liquid ice. When it spoke, its voice filled the entire chamber. You are the one who leads them, it said. The protector of the small warm ones. That's right, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. And I'm telling you to let them go. The creature laughed, and the sound was like icicles falling on stone. You do not understand, little guardian. We are the true protectors of this place. We have slept beneath the ice for 10,000 years, waiting for the mountain to call us. Call you for what? To cleanse the sacred peak of those who would defile it. Your kind brings noise and fire, and the stench of metal to our holy mountain. You cut paths where no paths should be, climb heights meant only for the wind. Around the chamber, I could see other ice walkers emerging from the walls themselves, stepping out of solid ice like it was just mist. The old compact is broken, the leader continued. The guardians of flesh and blood have forgotten their duties, so we wake and we reclaim what was always ours. I thought about what Charlie Yazzie had said, old guardians stirring. He'd been talking about these things. The Athabascan people, I said. They knew about you. They remembered. They honored the mountain, took only what they needed, left offerings to appease our sleep. But your people, the creature's eyes blazed brighter. Your people treat our sacred mountain like a playground. Behind me, I could hear movement. Jenny and the survivors were making their way toward the entrance. Maybe you're right, I said, backing slowly toward the tunnel. Maybe we've forgotten how to respect this place. But those people didn't know. They're not your enemies. Ignorance is not innocence, the creature said. The mountain has chosen. All who trespass must face the cold judgment. That's when I heard Jenny scream from behind me. I turned and ran back toward the entrance, leaving the ice walkers in their cathedral of cold. When I reached the mouth of the cave, I found Jenny and the survivors surrounded. 5 more ice walkers had appeared, blocking the entrance. These were smaller than their leader, maybe 12 feet tall, but their eyes burned with the same cold fire. In the center of their circle lay Jake's body, frozen solid like the others. His snowmobile was nearby, covered in ice so thick it looked like a sculpture. Now you see the price of trespass, said one of the creatures. I had 1 flare left, one tiny source of heat against beings made of living cold. But sometimes, that's all you need. I lit the flare and held it high. You want to talk about guardians? I've been protecting this mountain for 18 years. I've saved dozens of lives up here, pulled people out of crevasses, talked them out of stupid decisions that would have killed them. The creatures paused, watching me. Maybe I can't stop you, I continued. But I'm not going to let you kill these people without a fight. I threw the flare at the nearest ice walker. It hit the creature in the chest, and where the flame touched, steam rose from its body. The thing let out a shriek like breaking glass and staggered backward. "Run!" I shouted. But as we tried to break through their circle, the largest ice walker appeared at the cave entrance behind us. We were trapped. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about courage, about survival, and about the ancient powers that sleep beneath Alaska's frozen peaks. The ice walkers closed in around us, their breath turning the air into visible clouds of freezing mist. Jenny held the survivors close, trying to share what little body heat we had left. That's when David, the Canadian climber who'd been barely conscious, did something that saved us all. He stood up, shaky but determined, and pulled out a small leather pouch from inside his jacket. "Wait," he called to the creatures in a voice that was stronger than it should have been. The ice walkers stopped. David opened the pouch and poured something into his hand. Tobacco, sage, and what looked like small pieces of carved bone. "I know who you are," he said. "My grandmother was Inuit. She told me stories about the guardians of the sacred peaks." The Tulimak. The largest ice walker's eyes dimmed slightly. "You speak the old name." "Yes. And I know the old ways." David scattered the contents of the pouch onto the snow. "We offer this gift to the mountain spirits. We ask forgiveness for our trespass." For a moment, nobody moved. The wind had stopped completely, and the only sound was our breathing. Then the leader spoke. "The old compact is remembered. But remembering is not enough. The mountain has been wounded by too many who do not know, do not care. The bleeding must stop." "What if it did?" I heard myself saying. "What if we made sure people understood? What if we protected this place the way it deserves?" The creature looked at me with those burning, cold eyes. "You would do this? You would turn your own kind away from the sacred peak?" I thought about all the climbers I'd rescued over the years. All the people who came to Denali thinking it was just another mountain to conquer. Maybe some education was overdue. "Yes," I said. "If you let these people live, I'll make sure the word gets out. No more casual climbers. No more tourists treating McKinley like a theme park." The ice walkers seemed to communicate without words, their eyes flickering like aurora borealis. Finally, their leader nodded. "The compact is renewed, but it comes with a price." Before I could ask what price, the creature reached out and touched my forehead with one massive finger. The cold that shot through my skull was beyond anything I'd ever felt. It was like being dipped in liquid nitrogen, but the freezing went deeper than my skin. It went into my bones, my blood, my very soul. In that touch, I saw everything. I saw the ice walkers as they really were, not monsters, but guardians older than human civilization. I saw the mountain as they saw it, alive and sacred and wounded by decades of careless human intrusion, and I saw what they were really protecting. Deep beneath McKinley, sleeping in ice older than the Ice Age, was something else. Something that made the ice walkers look like gentle protectors. "Now you understand," the creature said, pulling its hand away. "Now you carry the cold with you always. You will remember. You will make others remember." I collapsed in the snow, my whole body shaking. When I looked at my hands, I could see frost patterns spreading across my skin, fading but not disappearing completely. "The compact is sealed," the leader said. "These may go. But know this, small guardian. If the mountain is dishonored again, if the sacred places are defiled, we will wake permanently. And next time, there will be no mercy." The ice walkers faded back into the mountain like they'd never been there at all. Jenny helped me to my feet, and together we got the survivors moving toward the valley. David's offering had bought us safe passage, but I could feel the creatures watching us every step of the way. We made it to the base station 3 hours later. The rescue helicopters that came for the survivors found us half frozen and babbling about impossible things. The official report listed the deaths as exposure and avalanche-related trauma. The climbing permits for McKinley's North Face were suspended indefinitely due to unprecedented weather patterns and geological instability. I retired from the Park Service 6 months later. The cold the ice walker had put in me never went away completely. Even now, living in Arizona where it's 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, I can still see ice crystals forming in the corners of my vision when I close my eyes. I kept my promise, though. I've spent the last few years writing letters to climbing magazines, talking to mountaineering groups, doing everything I can to spread the word about respecting sacred places. Most people think I'm just another ranger who cracked under pressure. They nod politely and file my warnings under interesting but irrelevant. But some listen, some understand, and late at night, when the wind is blowing just right, I still hear that ancient chanting carried on the air. The ice walkers are still up there, still watching, still guarding their sacred mountain. The compact holds. For now, but I know that if people forget again, if they start treating McKinley like just another peak to conquer, the guardians will wake. And next time, they won't be interested in making deals. Sometimes I wonder if that might not be such a bad thing. Maybe the mountain knows what it's doing. Maybe some places are too sacred, too powerful, too dangerous for people like us. Maybe some guardians should never sleep. My name is Diana Wolfhart, and I've been a park ranger for 13 years. People always ask about my last name. It's Inupiat, from my grandmother's side. She used to tell stories about the northern lights that would make your skin crawl. I never believed them, not until November 1983. I was 36 then, stationed at Gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska. It's about as far from civilization as you can get, 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where the sun doesn't rise for 2 months straight. Most people would go crazy in that darkness, but I loved it. The silence, the cold that bit at your cheeks, the way the snow crunched under your boots like broken glass. I wasn't always a ranger. Used to be a veterinarian down in Anchorage, but after my divorce, I needed something different, something real. Animals don't lie to you or break promises. They just are what they are. The call came in on November 15th, around noon, though noon looks the same as midnight up there. My radio crackled to life while I was checking equipment in my cabin. "Diana, this is Tom from headquarters. We got a problem." Tom Bearcloud was my supervisor, a good man who'd worked these parks longer than anyone. His voice sounded strange, tight. "What kind of problem?" I asked, setting down my coffee. "Research team up at Arajech Peaks, 5 people. They're all dead." I felt my stomach drop. "Accident? That's what we need you to find out. Bush planes spotted them yesterday. Bodies are arranged in some kind of pattern. No sign of struggle, no obvious cause of death." I grabbed my gear and headed out within the hour. The snowmobile ride to Arajech took me through country that could kill you just by being itself. Granite spires jutted up like broken teeth against the star-filled sky. The aurora was dancing that night, green sheets of light rippling across the darkness like something alive. My grandmother used to call them the hungry spirits. She'd grab my hand when I was little and pull me inside whenever they got too bright. "They're hunting," she'd whisper. "When the sky fire gets too strong, they come down to feed." I thought it was just stories. The research camp sat in a valley between 2 peaks, 5 orange tents arranged around a larger equipment shelter. My headlamp swept across the snow as I approached, and that's when I saw them. 5 bodies lying in the snow. But not random, they formed a perfect star pattern, each person exactly the same distance from the center. Their faces were turned up to the sky, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. I'd seen plenty of death in my time. Animal attacks, hypothermia, accidents. This was different. These people looked empty, like something had been drained right out of them. Dr. Sarah Chen, the team leader, lay at the top point of the star. I knew her from the research permit paperwork, a professor from the University of Alaska studying caribou migration patterns. Next to her lay her graduate students and research assistants, all frozen solid but with no visible wounds. What made my skin crawl was how peaceful they looked. No signs of panic, no defensive wounds, no tracks in the snow except for their own footprints leading from the camp to where they died. I checked each body carefully. No blood, no trauma, no obvious cause of death. But something was wrong with their skin. It had a grayish tint, like old paper. When I touched Dr. Chen's wrist to check for any identification, her skin felt strange, cold, yes, but also brittle, like it might crack. The camp itself told a different story. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Cameras, notebooks, and scientific instruments lay half buried in the snow. One tent was completely shredded, not by claws or knives, but like it had been pulled apart by invisible hands. I found Dr. Chen's field notebook near her tent. The last entry was dated November 13th, 2 days ago. Asterisk, day 12. Aurora activity unprecedented. Electromagnetic readings off the charts. Johnson swears he saw shapes in the lights last night. I told him it was just his imagination, but honestly, I'm starting to see things too. The animals have all left the area. Haven't seen so much as a ptarmigan in 3 days. Something has them spooked. Asterisk. The entry stopped there, mid-sentence, like she'd been interrupted. I set up my own equipment to run tests on the bodies and the surrounding area. Temperature readings showed something impossible. The snow directly under each body was warmer than it should be, forming perfect circles about 6 feet across. The permafrost had melted and refrozen, but in geometric patterns I'd never seen before. As I worked, the aurora grew brighter. Green shifted to blue, then to a purple so deep it was almost black. The lights seemed to pulse in rhythm, like a heartbeat. My radio started picking up interference, strange harmonics that made my teeth ache. That's when I found the camera. Dr. Chen's digital camera was half buried near her body. When I checked the photos, most showed normal research work, caribou tracks, camp life, data collection, but the last few images made my blood freeze. The first photo showed the aurora as usual, beautiful green curtains across the sky. The second photo, taken just minutes later, showed something else. Shapes in the lights, human-like figures, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, with arms that stretched too long. The third photo showed those figures descending toward the ground. The fourth and final photo was completely black except for 5 points of light arranged in a perfect star pattern. I stared at that camera for a long time, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The scientific part of my brain tried to find logical explanations. Camera malfunction, digital corruption, tricks of light and shadow, but my grandmother's voice whispered in the back of my mind, when the sky fire gets too strong, they come down to feed. The aurora pulsed brighter overhead, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw something moving in those dancing lights. Something that was watching me back. I packed up my initial findings and prepared to radio headquarters. But as I reached for the radio, it crackled to life on its own. Static filled the air, then something else, a sound like singing, but in no language I'd ever heard. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and it seemed to come from the lights themselves. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My breath came out in sharp puffs. And somewhere in the dancing aurora above, I saw shapes beginning to form. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact headquarters, but all I got was that strange singing mixed with static. The sound seemed to vibrate through my bones, making my vision blur at the edges. "Tom, come in." "Tom, do you copy?" Nothing but that alien music. The aurora was getting brighter by the minute, casting everything in an eerie green glow. I'd seen the northern lights thousands of times, but never like this. These lights seemed aware. They moved in patterns too deliberate to be natural, forming shapes that almost looked like letters in some cosmic alphabet. I set up my electromagnetic testing equipment, trying to focus on the science instead of the fear creeping up my spine. The readings were insane magnetic field fluctuations that should have been impossible this far from any major solar storm. As I worked, I kept glancing at Dr. Chen's research notes. She'd been tracking unusual aurora activity for weeks before her team died. According to her data, the lights had been growing stronger each night, displaying colors and movements that didn't match any known patterns. Asterisk, November 10th. Aurora appeared at least 2 hours before predicted. Local Inupiat guide refused to continue working with us, said the spirits were too hungry this year. Ridiculous superstition, but his fear seemed genuine. Asterisk, November 11th. Electromagnetic interference damaged 3 pieces of equipment overnight. Whatever's causing these aurora displays is incredibly powerful. Johnson calculated the energy output at nearly 10 times normal levels. Asterisk, November 12th. Wilson swears something touched his tent last night. Found strange marks in the snow, not animal tracks, but geometric patterns pressed into the surface. No logical explanation. Asterisk. I photographed each page with my own camera, trying to piece together what had happened. The deeper I dug into their research, the more unsettled I became. These weren't just random observations, they were documenting something that defied explanation. A sound made me look up from the notebook. Metal groaning, like the support poles of the research shelter were being twisted. But there was no wind, and the temperature was steady. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the main shelter. Inside, I found equipment scattered across the floor, computers, monitors, and sensitive instruments that represented months of research work. Everything was destroyed, but not in a way that made sense. The metal cases weren't dented or smashed. Instead, they looked drained, like something had sucked the life right out of them. One of the computers was still partially functional. I managed to power it up and access Dr. Chen's video logs. Most of the files were corrupted, but I found one that still played. The video showed Dr. Chen in the shelter 2 nights ago. She looked exhausted, her usually neat hair wild around her face. "This is day 11 of observation," she said to the camera. "I'm documenting phenomena that I can't explain through conventional science. The aurora activity has exceeded all known parameters. We've recorded electromagnetic pulses strong enough to disrupt our equipment from over 50 miles away." She paused, looking troubled. "But that's not the strangest part. Last night, all 5 of us saw the same thing. Figures in the lights. Human-shaped, but wrong. They moved with purpose, like they were searching for something." The video flickered, and when it stabilized, Dr. Chen looked frightened. "Johnson is missing. He went outside around midnight to check the weather instruments and never came back. We found his equipment a quarter mile away, but no sign of him. No tracks, no blood, nothing. It's like he just vanished." The video cut to static. I felt ice form in my stomach. According to the camp roster, Johnson was one of the 5 bodies I'd found arranged in that star pattern. But if he disappeared the night before the others died, how did he end up with them? My radio crackled again. This time, instead of that alien singing, I heard a voice. "Diana." It was my name, spoken clearly through the static. But the voice wasn't Tom's, and it wasn't anyone from headquarters. It sounded hollow, like an echo of someone who wasn't quite there. Diana Wolfhart. Now it knew my full name. My hands started shaking as I tried to respond. "Who is this? Identify yourself. Come outside, Diana. Come see." Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay in the shelter. But I was a park ranger, trained to investigate and help. If someone was out there, injured or lost, I had to respond. I grabbed my gear and stepped outside. The aurora had descended. What should have been lights hundreds of miles above the earth now hung just above the treetops, ribbons of green and blue fire dancing in the air like living things. They moved toward me with deliberate purpose. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I spun around. A man stood 20 feet away, tall, thin, wearing the same research gear as Dr. Chen's team. But his face was all wrong. Gray skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and his eyes reflected the aurora light like mirrors. "Johnson?" I whispered. He smiled, and I saw that his teeth were too white, too sharp. I was Johnson. Now I'm something more. The lights around him pulsed brighter, and I understood with sickening clarity. The aurora wasn't just electromagnetic phenomena, it was alive. And it was hungry. "We tried to study them," Johnson said, taking a step closer. "But you can't study something that's studying you back. They've been watching your world for centuries, waiting for the right conditions, waiting for the sky fire to grow strong enough. What do you want?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. "What we've always wanted. Energy, life force, the electromagnetic patterns that make you, you." He gestured to the lights dancing around us. "Your people call it a soul." The aurora began to descend further, reaching toward me like grasping fingers. Where the lights touched the ground, the snow hissed and steamed. Dr. Chen and the others, they volunteered their energy to help us manifest. "Now we can exist in your dimension, at least temporarily." Johnson's smile grew wider. "But 5 wasn't enough, we need more." I backed toward my snowmobile, never taking my eyes off him. "You're insane. This is impossible. Your grandmother didn't think so." That stopped me cold. "What?" "Elena Wolfhart. She knew about us. Her people have always known. They left offerings to keep us satisfied, animal blood, carved talismans, traditional ceremonies. But your generation forgot the old ways." He was right about my grandmother's name. There was no way he could have known that. The balance is broken, Johnson continued. We're hungrier than ever, and there's no one left who remembers how to feed us safely. The aurora lights writhed around him like snakes made of fire. But you remember, don't you? Deep down you can feel it. The old knowledge, passed down in your blood. I could feel it, a strange tingling in my bones, like the air before a lightning strike. Something ancient and primal was awakening in my mind. Fragments of stories and warnings my grandmother had whispered when I was small. Johnson raised his hand, and the aurora lights began to move toward me. Where they touched my skin, I felt a cold so deep it burned. My life force was being pulled out of me, drawn toward those hungry lights. I had seconds to act. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. Copper and iron, child, the old metals. The spirits cannot touch what's properly grounded. I grabbed the metal frame of my snowmobile and held on tight. The aurora lights recoiled like they'd been burned. Johnson's face twisted with rage. You can't run forever, Diana. We know where you are. We can taste your energy from miles away. The lights rose back into the sky, carrying Johnson with them. But before they disappeared completely, I heard his voice one last time, carried on the Arctic wind. We're coming for you. I started my snowmobile and raced back toward my cabin, the aurora dancing overhead like hunting wolves. Behind me, I could swear I heard something following, not footsteps, but the sound of electricity arcing through the air. Whatever had killed Dr. Chen's team wasn't finished, and now it knew I was here. I made it back to my cabin just as my radio finally crackled to life with a normal transmission. Diana, this is Tom. Sorry about the radio trouble. We've been getting weird interference all night. What's your status on the research team? My hands were still shaking as I grabbed the microphone. Tom, I need backup up here. All 5 team members are dead, and we've got a situation that's hard to explain. Dead? What happened? Animal attack? I looked out my window at the aurora still dancing overhead, brighter than I'd ever seen it. Not animals. Something else. Tom, I need you to get up here as soon as possible. And bring, I paused, wondering how to explain. Bring copper wire. As much as you can find. Copper wire? Diana, you're not making sense. Just trust me. And Tom, don't fly up here after dark. Whatever you do, don't come at night. There was a long pause. Diana, are you okay? You sound spooked. I am spooked. This is serious, Tom. Promise me you'll wait until daylight. Okay. Okay, I'll head up first thing in the morning. Try to get some rest. Rest, right, like I could sleep knowing those things were out there. I spent the next few hours turning my cabin into a fortress. My grandmother had always kept copper pennies in her pockets and wrapped copper wire around her windows during aurora season. I'd thought it was just another old superstition, but now I understood. I stripped every piece of copper wire from my radio equipment and electronics, wrapping it around the window frames and door. I spread copper mesh from my electrical supplies across the floor and connected everything to the metal grounding rod outside my cabin. By the time I finished, my small cabin looked like the inside of a science experiment, but I felt safer. The constant tingling in my bones had stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had lifted slightly. Around 3 a.m., I dozed off in my chair. I woke to the sound of my generator sputtering and dying. Through the window, I could see the aurora had descended again, pressing against my copper defenses like water against a dam. That's when I heard the voice outside. Diana? Diana, help me. It was Tom's voice, but that was impossible. He wasn't supposed to arrive until morning, and I hadn't heard any airplane engines. Diana, please, something's wrong with my plane. I'm hurt. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window. A figure stood in the snow, about 50 feet away, wearing Tom's familiar red parka. But something was off about the way he moved, too fluid, like he was floating just above the ground. Tom, how did you get here? Flew up early, couldn't wait after your call. My radio's busted, can you help me? The aurora lights swirled around the figure, and I caught glimpses of his face. It looked like Tom, but with that same gray, stretched skin I'd seen on Johnson. And his eyes reflected the green light like mirrors. Come inside, Tom, I've got medical supplies. Can't. Something's wrong with your cabin. There's electricity everywhere. Makes me uncomfortable. My copper defenses were working. Whatever these things were, they couldn't cross grounded metal barriers. Just break down the door, I called out. If you're really hurt, I'll help you. The Tom thing smiled, and I saw those same two sharp teeth. Can't do that, Diana. You'll have to come out. More figures emerged from the aurora lights. Dr. Chen, her graduate students, and other shapes I couldn't identify. They formed a circle around my cabin, just outside the range of my copper grid. We're patient, the Johnson thing said, stepping forward. We can wait, but eventually, you'll have to come out for food or water or when your generator runs out of fuel. He was right. I had maybe 2 days of supplies, and without the generator, I'd freeze to death in the Arctic cold. What do you really want? I shouted through the window. We told you. Energy, life force. But not just anyone's, the doctor. Chen Thing moved closer. We need someone with the old blood. Someone who can anchor us to this dimension permanently. Anchor you? Your grandmother's people knew the secret. With the right sacrifice, someone who carries the ancient bloodline, we can stay in your world. No more waiting for aurora seasons. No more hunting when the solar storms are strong enough. The realization hit me like ice water. They didn't just want to kill me. They wanted to use me as some kind of supernatural battery, a way to stay in our dimension permanently. We've been trying for generations, the Tom thing said. But your people scattered. The bloodlines were lost or forgotten. You're the first descendant of Elena Wolfhart we've found in over 40 years. My grandmother. They'd been hunting my family. She kept us at bay with her rituals and offerings, but when she died, the protections died with her. The circle of creatures moved closer to my copper defenses. Until now, we could only manifest during the strongest aurora displays. But if we can drain someone of her bloodline completely, we become permanent. The Johnson thing finished. Free to hunt whenever we choose. A new sound reached my ears, the distant drone of an aircraft engine. Tom's plane, the real Tom, arriving just as he'd promised. But it was still dark outside, hours before dawn. No, I whispered. Tom, turn around, get out of here. The creatures heard the plane too. They looked up at the sky with hungry expressions, aurora lights dancing around them like excited pets. More energy, the Dr. Chen thing said with delight. How convenient. I grabbed my emergency flare gun and ran outside, breaking my own protection to warn Tom away. The moment I stepped beyond my copper grid, I felt the aurora lights reaching for me, trying to drain my life force. Tom, I screamed, firing the flare into the sky. Don't land, stay away. But it was too late. Tom's small bush plane was already coming in for landing, its lights cutting through the darkness. He couldn't see the aurora creatures from up there. They probably looked like aurora phenomena, just beautiful lights in the sky. The plane touched down on the small airstrip near my cabin. I ran toward it, the creatures following close behind. Aurora lights reached out like grabbing hands, but I stayed just ahead of them. Tom climbed out of the plane, pulling off his helmet. Diana, what the hell are you doing out here without? He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the aurora lights descending around us. Those lights, they're too low. That's not possible. Tom, get back in the plane. Now. But the aurora had already surrounded the aircraft. The creatures emerged from the lights, Johnson, Dr. Chen, and the others, all wearing their stolen faces like masks. Tom stumbled backward. Diana, what? Who are these people? Not people, I said, grabbing his arm. Run. We made it maybe 20 yards before the aurora lights caught up. Tom screamed as the electromagnetic energy hit him, aging him rapidly before my eyes. His dark hair turned white in seconds. His skin wrinkled and sagged. In moments, he looked like he'd aged 30 years. Diana, he gasped, reaching for me. What's happening to me? The Johnson thing appeared beside him. He's being drained. Don't worry, it doesn't hurt for long. I watched in horror as Tom's life force was pulled out of him like smoke, drawn into the aurora lights. His eyes went glassy, then empty. His body collapsed in the snow like an empty shell. No, I screamed, lunging toward him. But the creatures caught me, aurora lights wrapping around my arms like electric chains. Now you, the Dr. Chen thing said, time to fulfill your destiny. The lights began to drain me too, pulling at something essential deep inside my chest. But as they did, something else awakened, memories buried in my blood. Knowledge passed down through generations of my grandmother's people. I remembered the old words, the protective chants Elena Wolfhart had whispered to me as a child. I remembered the symbols she'd drawn in the dirt, the warnings she'd given about respecting the spirits of the sky, and I remembered how to fight back. As the aurora lights drained my energy, my grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in the wind. The hungry spirits fear one thing above all, a willing sacrifice that turns the hunt back on them. I stopped fighting the drain and let the creatures pull at my life force. They grew brighter, more solid, thinking they were winning. But what they didn't understand was that I was feeding them something else, along with my energy, my grandmother's knowledge, her protective magic, passed down through blood and memory. Yes, the Johnson thing hissed. Give us everything. The aurora lights pulsed brighter around me, but I felt something changing in their grip. The knowledge flowing from me was like poison to them, burning them from the inside even as they fed. What is this? The Dr. Chen thing shrieked, suddenly releasing me. What are you doing? Something my grandmother taught me. I gasped, struggling to my feet. She said the old spirits could be turned against each other, fed the wrong kind of energy. I began chanting in Inupiat, words I'd thought I'd forgotten. My grandmother had made me memorize them as a child, though I'd never understood their meaning. Now the words flowed from my lips like they were alive, and the aurora creatures recoiled as if I'd struck them with fire. Impossible, the Johnson thing snarled. The old knowledge is lost. Elena Wolfhart took it to her grave. She passed it to me, I said, continuing the chant. Blood to blood, memory to memory. The creatures circled me, but they couldn't come closer. My words were creating a barrier they couldn't cross, a spiritual grounding more powerful than any copper wire. But the chant was also draining me. I could feel my strength fading with each word, each line of the protective ritual. I had maybe minutes before I collapsed. That's when I understood what my grandmother had really taught me. Not just protection, transformation, the ability to turn hunter into hunted. I reached the final verse of the chant and spoke the words that would either save me or destroy me. I offer my life willingly to anchor you forever, not to our world, but to the space between worlds. Let the hungry spirits starve in the void they created. The aurora lights exploded outward, brighter than the sun. The creatures screamed, but their screams were being pulled away from them, drawn into some cosmic drain I couldn't see. What have you done? The Dr. Chen thing wailed. What you wanted, I said. I'm anchoring you, but not here. I'm sending you to feed on each other for eternity. The aurora began to spiral inward, forming a whirlpool of light that pulled at the creatures like a cosmic vacuum. They fought against it, but they were caught in their own hunger, unable to release the connection they'd forged with me. One by one, they were drawn into the spiral. The Johnson thing reached toward me as he was pulled away. This isn't over, he screamed. Others will come. The hungry spirits are legion. Then I'll be waiting, I said. The last thing I saw was the Tom thing, not the creature wearing his face, but something that looked like Tom's actual spirit, freed from the aurora's grip. Thank you, he whispered, and then he was gone too, not dragged away, but ascending, finally at peace. The spiral of light collapsed in on itself and vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness with Tom's empty body and the wreckage of his plane. I stumbled back to my cabin as dawn finally began to break over the mountains. The aurora was gone, and the oppressive feeling of being hunted had lifted. But I could feel something had changed inside me. The ritual had marked me, connected me to the space between worlds in a way I didn't fully understand. When the rescue team arrived 3 hours later, I told them what I could, that Tom had crashed in a sudden aurora storm, that the research team had died of exposure, that electromagnetic interference had caused equipment failures. They believed me because they wanted to believe me. The alternative was too strange to consider. But I knew the truth. The aurora spirits weren't gone, just these particular ones. Others would come, drawn by the same cosmic hunger. And when they did, I'd be ready. 6 months later, I'm still stationed at Gates of the Arctic, but everything has changed. The official reports blamed the deaths on a rare electromagnetic storm that caused equipment failures and disorientation. The research station was permanently closed, and the area was marked as unsafe for long-term habitation. But I stayed. Someone has to. The ritual my grandmother taught me didn't just banish those particular aurora spirits, it changed me. I can feel electromagnetic disturbances now, sense when the northern lights are carrying more than just solar particles. When the aurora appears, I know whether it's natural or something hungrier. Most nights, it's just beautiful lights dancing across the sky. But sometimes, maybe once every few weeks, I feel that familiar tingling in my bones. I see shapes in the lights that move with purpose. And I know they're testing my defenses, looking for weakness. I've learned more of my grandmother's protections. I've found other descendants of the old bloodlines, people scattered across Alaska and northern Canada who carry fragments of the ancient knowledge. We share information, warn each other when the spirits are particularly active, maintain the old barriers that keep our world safe. The copper wire still surrounds my cabin, but I've added other protections. Traditional symbols carved into stone, iron stakes driven into the permafrost, and plants my grandmother said the spirits feared. Most importantly, I've learned the complete ritual, not just the words, but the understanding behind them. Tom's family held a memorial service in Anchorage. I attended, though I couldn't tell them how he really died. His wife thanked me for being with him at the end, for making sure he wasn't alone. If only she knew how true that was. I keep his picture on my desk next to photos of Dr. Chen's research team. They deserve to be remembered as the scientists and explorers they were, not as the twisted things they became. Sometimes I think I can see their spirits in the natural aurora displays, finally at peace, finally free. The Park Service has tried to transfer me several times. They think the isolation is getting to me, that I'm becoming too attached to this remote posting. They don't understand that I can't leave. This is where I belong now, standing watch at the edge of the world. Last week, I received a letter from an Inupiat elder in Barrow. She'd heard about the incidents at Arijech through the Native Community Network. The letter was written in careful English, but I could sense the deeper meaning beneath the words. Asterisk, Diana Wolfhart, daughter of Elena's blood. We know what you did. We know what you carry now. The old compact has been renewed, but the price is always high. When the skyfire grows hungry again, remember, you are the anchor that keeps them from our world. Guard well, granddaughter. Guard always. Asterisk. She was right about the price. I've aged since that night in November. Not physically, but in other ways. I see things differently now, feel the weight of knowledge that was never meant for one person to carry alone. But I also feel purpose in a way I never did as a veterinarian or even as a park ranger. 2 nights ago, the aurora appeared again with that telltale wrongness. I felt them testing my defenses, probing for weakness. But this time, I was ready. I spoke the protective words my grandmother had taught me, and the hungry lights retreated back to whatever space between worlds they inhabit. They'll return. Maybe not for months, maybe not for years, but they'll return. The cosmic forces that created them haven't changed. The hunger that drives them is eternal. And somewhere out there, other descendants of the old bloodlines are standing their own watch, keeping their own vigil against the things that hunt between the stars. But for now, the lights in the sky are just lights. The aurora dances with natural beauty, painting the darkness in shades of green and blue that take your breath away. Tourists come to see the northern lights, never knowing how close they sometimes come to something that would gladly take that breath forever. I watch from my cabin window as another display begins, checking automatically for signs of movement that shouldn't be there. Tonight, it's just physics, solar particles colliding with our atmosphere, creating one of nature's most beautiful shows. Tonight, we're safe. But I'll keep watching. I'll keep the old knowledge alive. And when the skyfire grows hungry again, I'll be ready. My name is Diana Wolfhart, and I am the granddaughter of Elena's blood. I stand guard at the edge of the world, where the hungry spirits dance in lights that most people think are beautiful. Some nights, they are. Other nights, they're hunting. And I make sure they go home empty-handed. The aurora fades as dawn approaches, and I settle back into my chair with a cup of coffee. Outside, the first hints of sunlight touch the mountain peaks, painting them gold and pink. In a few hours, the darkness will return. It always does up here in winter. But so will I be here, watching and waiting. Because some hunts never really end. They just pause between the lights. My name is Jonathan Ashwalker, and I've been a park ranger at Katmai for 16 years. People always ask about my last name. Truth is, my grandfather gave it to our family after he survived the Great Fire of 1918 up in Fairbanks. Said he walked through the ashes for 3 days to find safety. The name stuck. I'm 45 now, been alone since my wife Sarah died in a car accident 5 years back. The job keeps me busy enough not to think too much about the empty cabin waiting for me each night. Katmai isn't like other parks. We don't get families with kids and picnic baskets here. This place is all volcanoes and ash, steam vents, and hot springs that can cook you alive if you're not careful. The Valley of 10,000 Smokes earned its name back in 1912 when Mount Katmai blew its top. Still smoking today, all these years later. My job is keeping the few scientists who come here from getting themselves killed. Most folks think volcano work is exciting. Truth is, it's mostly checking equipment, reading numbers, and making sure nobody falls into a steam pit. The local Alutiiq people have stories about this place. Old Pete Nuka, who brings supplies sometimes, calls them fire demons. Says his grandmother saw them dancing in the flames when the mountain exploded all those years ago. I always figured these were just stories people told to explain things they didn't understand back then. Science explains volcanoes just fine without needing spirits and demons. July 1983 was hotter than usual. The steam vents were working overtime, and the ground temperatures were running higher than normal. Nothing dangerous, just the mountain doing what mountains do. I'd been doing routine checks on the monitoring stations scattered around the crater rim when Dr. Martinez and his research team arrived from the university. 6 people total, 3 geologists, 2 graduate students, and a photographer. They wanted to set up some new equipment to study the chemical makeup of the volcanic gases. Standard stuff. I showed them the safe zones, explained the dangers, gave them the usual speech about staying away from the unstable ground near the fumaroles. Dr. Martinez seemed like a smart guy. Been studying volcanoes for 20 years, he said. Had worked at Mount St. Helens after it blew in 1980. The team set up their base camp about half a mile from the most active area, right where I told them to. Everything looked good. That was 3 days ago. This morning, old Pete came racing into my station in his beat-up truck, eyes wide as dinner plates. He'd been delivering supplies to the research camp and found something that made him turn around and drive straight to me without stopping. "John," he said, hands shaking as he poured himself coffee. "You need to go up there right now. Something's wrong. Real wrong." I grabbed my radio and tried calling the research team. Nothing but static. Could be equipment problems, happen sometimes with all the electromagnetic interference from the volcanic activity. But Pete's face told me this wasn't about broken radios. "What did you see, Pete?" He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. The camp's still there. Tents, equipment, everything, but the people. He shook his head. "John, there's nothing left but ash. Human-shaped piles of ash where people should be." I loaded my truck with emergency gear and drove up to the research camp. Pete followed in his own vehicle, though I could see he didn't want to go back. The dirt road wound through fields of old volcanic rock and patches of hardy grass that somehow grew in this harsh place. The camp looked normal from a distance. 6 tents in a neat circle, equipment stations set up exactly where they should be. Solar panels still working, computers humming quietly in the outdoor lab setup. Nothing burned, nothing damaged. But no people. I found the first pile of ash next to the main equipment station. Fine gray powder, in the perfect shape of a human body, lying on the ground. Arms, legs, even the head. All there in ash form, like someone had been instantly cremated, but the ashes had kept their shape. "Jesus," Pete whispered, staying close to the trucks. I knelt down next to the ash pile. It was still warm. Not hot enough to burn, but warmer than it should be after sitting in the open air. The weird thing was how clean the outline was. The ash didn't scatter or blow away like normal ash would. It held together like it was glued in place. 5 more ash piles around the camp. 6 people, 6 perfect ash shadows. But their clothes were gone completely, not burned, gone. And all their personal metal items, watches, belt buckles, rings, were sitting in small melted puddles right where they should be on the bodies. The equipment told a strange story. The temperature sensors had recorded readings that didn't make sense. According to the data, the air temperature had spiked to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for about 30 seconds at 3:17 a.m. That's hot enough to melt copper. But the plastic equipment covers weren't even warped. "This isn't right," I said, checking the seismic readings. The ground sensors showed something impossible. Vibrations that matched a human heartbeat. Not random earthquake tremors, but a steady rhythm like a giant heart beating under the earth. Pete was backing toward his truck. "We should leave, John. This place, it feels wrong." He was right. The air seemed thicker here, like trying to breathe through hot soup, and the sounds were off. Usually, you could hear the constant hiss and bubble of the steam vents, the crack of settling rock. Today, everything was too quiet. I was packing up the data when I noticed the footprints. They started right at the edge of camp and led toward the main crater, about 200 yards away. But these weren't normal footprints. They were burned into the solid rock like someone had walked with feet made of fire. Each print glowed with a dull red light, still hot hours after being made. "Pete, look at this." He came over reluctantly, saw the glowing footprints, and immediately crossed himself. "Fire demons," he said quietly. "My grandmother's stories, they're real." I wanted to argue with him, to find a scientific explanation. Maybe some kind of underground gas leak or unusual chemical reaction. But standing there, looking at footprints burned into solid stone, science felt very small and far away. The footprints led straight toward the crater rim, where the biggest fumaroles sent up constant columns of steam and sulfur gas. As we followed them, the air got hotter and the smell of sulfur stronger. About halfway there, my radio crackled to life. But it wasn't a voice that came through. It was a sound like wind through a cave, or water boiling in a deep pot. And underneath that, something that might have been breathing. "Hello?" I said into the radio. "This is Ranger Station Alpha. Anyone copy?" The breathing sound got louder. Then, clear as day, a woman's voice came through. "Jonathan, help us. So hot, can't escape." I recognized the voice. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the graduate students. But Sarah Chen was an ash pile back at the camp. Pete grabbed my arm. "Don't answer it. Whatever's talking, it ain't human anymore." The radio went quiet. We stood there in the sulfur-stinking air, watching steam rise from the crater ahead of us. In that steam, just for a second, I could swear I saw shapes moving. Human-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too bright, like people made of fire. That's when I decided we needed to get off this mountain, fast. We made it back to my station just as Dr. Sarah Cindermore's helicopter was landing. Sarah was a specialist in volcanic emergencies, someone the Park Service called in when things went really bad. I'd worked with her before during the 1980 eruption scare. Smart, tough, and not easily spooked. But when I told her what we'd found at the research camp, even Sarah looked worried. "Spontaneous human combustion," she said, studying the photos I'd taken. "That's not scientifically possible, John. People don't just burst into flames." Then explain the ash piles. Explain the melted metal. Explain temperature readings that should have fried everything in a half-mile radius. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking at the data printouts. "There's been unusual seismic activity all along the Ring of Fire this month. Yellowstone, Mount Rainier, even some volcanoes in Japan. Something stirring." Pete spoke up from the corner, where he'd been sitting quietly. "It's the fire spirits. They're waking up." Sarah gave him the look scientists always gave when local people talked about spirits and demons. "Mr. Nuka, I understand you have cultural traditions, but we need to focus on scientific explanations." "Science didn't save those 6 people," Pete said simply. That evening, Sarah insisted on going up to the crater to take her own readings. I tried to talk her out of it, but she was determined to get samples from the fumaroles. We loaded up her equipment and headed back up the mountain. The glowing footprints were brighter now, and there were more of them. They crisscrossed the area around the crater, like several people had been walking back and forth. The strange thing was, some of the prints were small, like a woman's feet. Others were huge, bigger than any human could make. "My God," Sarah said, kneeling next to one of the larger prints. "The rock is actually melted. Whatever made this had to be at least 1,500 degrees." We set up the equipment near the main fumarole, the biggest steam vent on the crater rim. Sarah was taking gas samples when the ground started shaking. Not an earthquake. I'd felt plenty of those. This was more like the mountain was breathing. "John, look at this," Sarah called out, staring at her instruments. "The gas composition is changing. There's an element here I've never seen before." That's when we heard the voice. It came from inside the fumarole itself, carried up with the steam and sulfur gas, deep, like rocks grinding together, but definitely words. "Who disturbs our sleep?" Sarah dropped her sample container. That's impossible. Gas emissions can't create speech patterns. The voice came again, louder this time. Too long. Have you broken the sacred ground? And then they came up out of the steam. 3 figures made of living fire and molten rock. They had human shapes but stood 8 feet tall, their bodies shifting and flowing like lava. Their eyes burned like stars, and when they moved, the ground cracked under their feet. Sarah, run! But Sarah just stood there, staring at the creatures like she was hypnotized. One of them reached toward her, and she didn't even try to get away. So beautiful, she whispered. The heat. It's calling to me. The fire creature touched her shoulder, and Sarah's whole body burst into flames. But she didn't scream. She laughed. Like she was happy. Her skin turned red, then orange, then white-hot like metal in a forge. In seconds, she wasn't Sarah anymore. She was one of them. The Sarah thing turned toward me with burning eyes. When she spoke, her voice was like hot coals falling down a chimney. Jonathan, join us. The fire is so warm. One Dumbledore spoke. I ran. Behind me, I could hear them following. Their footsteps sounded like hammers hitting an anvil. The ground shook with each step, and I could feel heat on my back like standing too close to a campfire. I made it to my truck and gunned the engine. In the rearview mirror, I could see them standing at the crater rim, watching me go. The Sarah thing raised one burning hand in what might have been a wave. Pete was waiting at my station with his truck already running. We need to leave, he said. The whole mountain's waking up. I can feel it. He was right. The ground was shaking constantly now, and the sky was glowing red from the crater. In the distance, I could see more figures moving in the steam, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Where can we go? I asked. Pete looked toward the mountains. My grandmother's cabin, it's built on sacred ground. The fire spirits won't go there. As we drove away from Katmai, the mountain rumbled behind us like a giant beast stirring from sleep. The fire demons were awake, and they were angry. Pete's grandmother's cabin sat on a hill, overlooking a small lake about 20 miles from the park. It was a simple log building, maybe 60 years old, with traditional Alutiiq symbols carved into the doorframe. The moment we stepped inside, the oppressive heat that had been following us disappeared. This place is protected, Pete explained, lighting an oil lamp. My great-great-grandmother built it here after the 1912 eruption. She knew the fire spirits would come back someday. Through the window, we could see the red glow on the horizon where Katmai was lighting up the night sky. The mountain was more active now than it had been in decades. Emergency radio broadcasts were reporting unusual volcanic activity all across Alaska. Pete made coffee on an old wood stove and told me the real story about the fire demons. The Tikigak aren't evil, he said. They're guardians, been sleeping in the earth's fire since the world was made. But people keep disturbing the sacred places, drilling and digging and taking samples. The spirits wake up angry. So what do they want? Respect, and for people to stop treating the earth like it belongs to them. I thought about Dr. Martinez and his team. Good people, just trying to understand how volcanoes worked. They hadn't deserved what happened to them. There has to be a way to stop this, I said. Pete shook his head. You can't stop them. You can only ask them to sleep again. But it has to be done right, with the proper ceremonies, and it has to be done by someone they trust. Who would they trust? Someone who understands that science and spirit can work together. Someone who's walked in both worlds. He was looking at me when he said it. The radio crackled, and we heard emergency broadcasts about volcanic activity spreading across the region. Mount Redoubt was showing signs of eruption. Mount Cleveland was venting steam. Even Yellowstone was registering unusual seismic activity. It's not just Katmai, I realized. They're waking up everywhere. The Tikigak are calling to their brothers and sisters, Pete said. If we don't do something soon, mountains all across the world will start erupting. I knew he was right. I'd seen the scientific data, felt the supernatural forces at work. This wasn't something that could be fought with equipment or evacuations. It needed something else. What would the ceremony involve? Pete pulled an old leather pouch from his jacket. Inside were chunks of glacier ice, wrapped in sealskin. Ice from the sacred glacier. Offering of respect. And words in the old language that asks the spirits to return to their sleep. And you think they'll listen to me? They spoke to you through the radio. They let you escape when they could have caught you. I think they're waiting to see what you'll do." Outside, the red glow was getting brighter. We could hear rumbling in the distance, and the lake water was starting to steam. "They're coming here," Pete said quietly. Through the window, I could see shapes moving in the darkness, tall figures that glowed like coals, walking across the landscape. There were dozens of them now, all heading toward the cabin. But when they reached the edge of the sacred ground, they stopped. They formed a circle around the hill, watching and waiting. "What are they waiting for?" "For you to decide," Pete said. "Fight them or work with them." I took the pouch of glacier ice and walked outside. The Tikigak were even more impressive up close. They towered over me, their bodies shifting and flowing like living lava. But they didn't attack. They just watched with those burning eyes. The largest one stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was like distant thunder. "Jonathan Ashwalker, you have walked through ash and fire. You have seen the sacred flames. What do you choose?" I held up the glacier ice. "I choose respect." The creature nodded slowly. "Then speak the words of peace." Pete had taught me the pronunciation, but speaking words in a language older than written history, while standing in front of beings made of living fire, was harder than I'd expected. My voice shook, but I got through the ceremony. "Great spirits of earth and fire, we ask forgiveness for disturbing your rest. We offer this ice from the sacred glacier as a sign of our respect. Please return to your sleep in the deep places, and we will guard the sacred grounds with proper reverence." The Tikigak listened in silence. When I finished, the largest one reached out one burning hand toward the ice. The moment they touched, there was a flash of steam and light. "It is acceptable," the creature said. "But remember, Ashwalker, the sacred places must be protected. If they are violated again, we will not sleep so peacefully." One by one, the fire spirits walked back toward the crater. As they went, they sank into the ground like they were melting back into the earth itself. The last one to go was the Sarah thing. She paused at the edge of the sacred ground and looked back at me. For just a moment, her burning eyes looked sad and human. Then she was gone, leaving only the smell of sulfur and cooling rock. The volcanic activity stopped that night, not just at Katmai, but all across the region. The emergency broadcasts reported that seismic readings had returned to normal. Gas emissions had decreased, and ground temperatures were cooling rapidly. I stayed at Pete's grandmother's cabin for 3 days, partly to make sure the crisis was really over, partly because I wasn't ready to go back to my empty ranger station. Pete and I spent the time talking about the old stories, the ways that science and traditional knowledge could work together instead of fighting each other. When I finally returned to Katmai, I found the research camp exactly as we'd left it. The ash piles were gone, blown away by the wind. The equipment was still functional, though the data from that night would never make sense to anyone who hadn't been there. The Park Service wanted a full report, of course. I told them the truth. That unusual volcanic activity had caused a tragic accident, killing the research team through exposure to superheated gases. The melted metal and burned footprints could be explained by localized gas emissions and underground hotspots. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the truth people could accept. I kept my job, but my duties changed. Instead of just monitoring equipment, I became the cultural liaison between the Park Service and the local Alutiiq communities. Pete helped me learn the traditional stories, the proper ways to show respect to the volcanic spirits, the ceremonies that keep the sacred places peaceful. Scientists still come to study the volcanoes, but now they work with local knowledge instead of ignoring it. We monitor the mountains using both instruments and traditional signs. So far, the Tikigak have stayed asleep. Most nights, I sit on my porch and look across the valley toward Mount Katmai. The mountain steams peacefully in the distance, just like it has for decades. To most people, it looks like a normal, if impressive, volcano. But sometimes, when the wind is right and the air is very still, I can see shapes moving in the steam. Tall figures that glow like embers, walking through their underground kingdom, watching, waiting, making sure that the sacred places stay sacred. Old Pete visits sometimes, bringing stories and traditional ice from the glacier. He says his grandmother would be proud that the fire spirits and the modern world have found a way to live in peace. But remember, John, he always says before he leaves, peace with the spirits isn't something you win once. It's something you have to earn every day. I remember. Every morning when I checked the volcanic monitoring equipment, I also performed the small ceremony Pete taught me. A few words in the old language, a piece of glacier ice melted into the ground, a promise to protect the sacred places. The Tikigaks sleep peacefully in their deep caves of fire and stone. And I sleep peacefully too, knowing that some things are more important than science or career or being right. Sometimes the old ways and the new ways can work together, if people are willing to listen, but I still keep a chunk of sacred glacier ice in my emergency kit, just in case. The fire spirits of Katmai are sleeping, but they're never really gone. They're part of the mountain now, part of the land, part of the story that connects the past to the future. And as long as people remember to show proper respect to the forces that shape our world, that story can have a peaceful ending. At least, that's what I tell myself on the quiet nights when the mountain glows a little brighter than usual, and the steam carries whispers in languages older than human memory. Some stories never really end. They just wait underground, patient as stone, warm as fire, ready to wake up again if the world forgets how to listen. My name is Samuel Icevein, and I've been a ranger at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for 15 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at me. Bears, wolves, blizzards that could freeze a man solid in minutes. I was wrong. It started in August 1982, during the brief Arctic summer when the sun never sets. I was stationed at the Canning River Delta, where the porcupine caribou herd comes through every year like clockwork. 50,000 animals moving across the tundra like a brown river. It's something that takes your breath away, even after all these years. My radio crackled that morning while I was checking my equipment. "Sam, this is base. We've got a problem." "What kind of problem, Jenny?" I asked, adjusting the antenna on my ATV. The whole herd changed direction overnight. They're heading west instead of north toward the calving grounds. I stopped what I was doing. In 15 years, I'd never seen the caribou change their ancient migration route. These animals follow paths their ancestors carved out thousands of years ago. Something big had to scare them off course. Any idea what spooked them? That's the other problem. We lost contact with the research team yesterday. 5 biologists studying the migration. They were supposed to check in every 12 hours. My stomach dropped. The Arctic doesn't forgive mistakes. If something happened to that team, we might already be too late. I fired up my ATV and headed across the tundra. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills covered in brown grass and tiny flowers that bloom for just a few weeks each year. No trees, no rocks big enough to hide behind. Just open space under a sun that refused to set. The radio silence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Dr. Martinez and his team were experienced. They knew the rules out here. Always check in, always stay together, always respect the wilderness. For them to go quiet meant something serious had happened. As I drove, I noticed how quiet everything was. Not normal quiet, wrong quiet. No birds calling, no ground squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was my engine cutting through air so still, it felt thick as water. My grandfather used to tell stories about times like this. He was Gwich'in, part of the people who'd lived in this land for thousands of years. When the animals go silent, he'd say, "Something old is walking." I used to think it was just superstition. Now, bouncing across empty tundra with nothing but silence around me, those stories didn't seem so crazy anymore. 3 hours later, I spotted their camp. Even from a distance, I could see something was wrong. The bright orange research tents were scattered like someone had kicked them around. Equipment lay broken and twisted across the ground. I stopped the ATV 50 yards out and grabbed my rifle. Not that it would help much against a polar bear, but it made me feel better. As I got closer, the smell hit me. That sweet, sick odor of meat left too long in the sun. The team was dead. All 5 of them, torn apart like they'd been attacked by something with claws and teeth the size of kitchen knives. But that wasn't the strangest part. Around the camp, I found tracks in the soft mud by the river. They started as human footprints, clear boot marks heading toward the tents, but as they got closer to the bodies, they changed. The heel marks got deeper, the toes spread wider. By the time they reached the camp, they weren't human anymore. They were wolf prints, but bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen. I followed the tracks away from the camp until they disappeared into rocky ground. Whatever had killed those people, it had walked in on 2 legs and left on 4. That night, setting up my own camp 2 miles away from the massacre, I called in my report. Jenny's voice sounded small and far away through the static. "Sam, are you sure about those tracks?" "I'm sure." "And Jenny, the caribou aren't just spooked, they're running from something." After I signed off, I sat outside my tent in the midnight sun, cleaning my rifle and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, telling stories I'd heard 100 times as a kid. Stories about shapeshifters, about things that could walk as men and hunt as beasts. Skinwalkers were Navajo legends, I said out loud to the empty tundra. Nothing like that exists up here. But as I said it, I heard something in the distance. A howl that started low and animal, then shifted into something that sounded almost like human crying. It came from the direction of the research camp, and it went on for a long, long time. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning brought no relief. I found fresh tracks around my camp, the same impossible prints that changed from human to animal. Whatever had killed the research team was following me now. I packed quickly and headed toward where I'd last spotted the caribou herd. Maybe, if I could figure out what scared them, I could understand what I was dealing with. The tracks followed me for the first mile, then disappeared into a rocky creek bed. The silence was getting worse. I'd been in the Arctic long enough to know its sounds: the whistle of wind through grass, the splash of rivers, the calls of hundreds of bird species. Now there was nothing. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Around noon, I crested a low hill and found the caribou. They were packed together in a tight group at the bottom of a valley. Thousands of animals pressed close, like they were trying to protect each other. Calves stayed in the center, while the big bulls faced outward, antlers lowered. I'd never seen them behave like this. Through my binoculars, I watched the edges of the herd. The animals kept looking toward a ridge about a quarter-mile north, ears forward, muscles tense. Whatever they were afraid of was up there. I drove closer, keeping low. The ridge was covered in loose stones and patches of grass. Nothing moved. But the caribou kept staring at it like they could see something I couldn't. Then I spotted it, a shape that didn't belong. Too big to be a fox, wrong color to be a wolf. It was maybe 200 yards away, crouched behind a boulder, watching the herd the same way I was. I raised my binoculars and felt my blood turn cold. The thing looked like a man, but wrong. Too thin, arms too long, fingers that ended in dark points that might have been claws. It was naked despite the cold, skin pale as old bone. When it turned its head, I saw a face that was almost human, but stretched out like someone had pulled on both ends. We stared at each other across the valley. Even at that distance, I could feel its attention like a weight on my chest. Then it smiled, showing too many teeth, and melted back behind the rocks. I grabbed my radio. "Base, this is Sam. I need backup out here." "What's your situation?" "I found what spooked the herd. Send Lisa Crowfeather if you can, and tell her to bring the heavy rifle." Lisa was the only other ranger I trusted completely. She knew the land, knew how to track, and most importantly, she didn't ask stupid questions. If I said I needed backup, she'd come. While I waited, I kept watching the ridge. Nothing moved, but the caribou stayed bunched up and nervous. Every few minutes, some of the animals on the edge would bolt a few steps closer to the center, like something had gotten too close. An hour later, I heard the helicopter. Lisa sat down in a flat area near my ATV, and I jogged over as she climbed out. She was Gwich'in like my grandfather, small and tough with eyes that missed nothing. "What are we dealing with?" she asked, pulling her rifle from the helicopter. "Something that's been killing people and scaring the caribou. I saw it an hour ago, looked human, but wrong." She nodded like this made perfect sense. That was one thing I'd always liked about Lisa. She didn't waste time arguing with things she could see for herself. We climbed the ridge together, moving slow and quiet. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft ground. Those same impossible prints that shifted from human to animal and back. They led us to a flat area behind the boulder where I'd seen the creature. Lisa knelt by a patch of disturbed earth. "Sam, look at this." Scattered across the ground were pieces of skin, not fur or hide, actual human skin, thin and pale, lying in the grass like someone had molted. The pieces were still damp. "What kind of animal sheds skin like this?" I asked. "No animal," Lisa said quietly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about things like this. shapeshifters, things that could change form but had to leave parts of themselves behind. I was about to ask what she meant when we heard it, a sound from the valley below. The caribou were moving, not their usual calm migration, but a panicked stampede. 50,000 animals running like the world was ending. We scrambled to the edge of the ridge and looked down. In the middle of the fleeing herd, something was running with them. It looked like a massive wolf, bigger than a polar bear, keeping pace with animals that could run 30 miles per hour. But it wasn't hunting them, it was herding them, driving them toward the far end of the valley. "It's playing with them," Lisa whispered. The wolf thing suddenly stopped and looked up at us. Even at that distance, I could see intelligence in its eyes, not animal cunning but human thought. It tilted its head like it was considering something, then opened its mouth and howled. The sound hit us like a physical force. It started as a normal wolf howl but shifted and changed, becoming something that sounded like screaming wind, like metal tearing, like voices calling for help. The caribou ran faster, their panic spreading through the herd like wildfire. When the howl ended, the creature was gone. The herd kept running, disappearing over the horizon in a cloud of dust and terror. "We need to get back to the helicopter," Lisa said. But when we turned around, we found fresh tracks in the dirt behind us, human footprints, barefoot, heading straight toward where we'd left the aircraft. We ran. The helicopter was fine, but the tracks circled it 3 times before heading off toward the river. Whatever was hunting us had been close enough to touch the aircraft while we were watching the herd. "It's playing games," Lisa said, checking her rifle for the 10th time. I knew she was right. A normal predator would have attacked or fled. This thing was studying us, learning our patterns. The thought made my skin crawl. We set up camp that night in an open area with good sightlines in every direction, no cover for anything to sneak up on us. I took first watch while Lisa tried to sleep, but neither of us got much rest. Every sound made us jump, the whisper of wind through grass, the distant splash of a beaver in the river, the crack of settling permafrost. Around 3 in the morning, during my second watch, I saw movement near the river. A shape that looked like a person walking along the bank, but the walk was wrong. Too fluid, like the joints bent in directions they shouldn't. It was maybe 100 yards away, just at the edge of what I could see clearly in the pale midnight sun. I woke Lisa quietly and pointed. She grabbed her binoculars and watched for a long moment. "It's not trying to hide," she whispered. "It wants us to see it." The figure stopped directly across from our camp and waved. A normal, human wave, like it was saying hello. Then it dropped down on all 4s and became something with 4 legs and a long tail. The transformation was fluid, natural, like watching water pour from one container to another. "We need to call for evacuation," I said. Lisa nodded, but when I reached for the radio, she grabbed my arm. "Look." The thing by the river was gone, but there were new sounds around us, the soft pad of feet moving through grass, the whisper of something large moving in a circle around our camp. We sat back to back, rifles ready, listening to whatever it was spiral closer. The sound stopped. In the silence that followed, we heard breathing that wasn't ours. Slow, deep breaths coming from maybe 20 feet away. But when I shone my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. "Sam," Lisa whispered, "do you smell that?" I did. The same sweet, rotten smell from the research camp. The smell of meat left too long in the sun. The breathing moved. Now it was on the other side of our camp, then behind us, then in front again. Whatever was out there was circling us, staying just outside the range of our lights. "Why isn't it attacking?" I asked. "Maybe it's waiting for something," Lisa said, but her voice sounded strange, distant. I turned to look at her and felt my heart stop. Lisa was still there, still holding her rifle, but her eyes were wrong. They reflected the light like an animal's eyes, bright and golden. When she smiled, her teeth looked too sharp. "Lisa?" "I'm fine, Sam." But her voice was different now. Deeper, with an odd accent I couldn't place. "Why don't you put down the rifle?" I rolled away from her and came up with my gun pointed at what I hoped was still my friend. The thing that looked like Lisa tilted its head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She tastes like fear and determination," it said in Lisa's voice. "Strong flavors. I think I'll keep this form for a while." "Where is she?" "Gone. But don't worry, she didn't suffer much." The creature wearing Lisa's face stood slowly, rifle still in hand. In the pale Arctic light, I could see details that were almost right, but not quite. The proportions were slightly off, the movements too smooth. Like a very good photograph of Lisa, but missing something essential. "What are you?" I asked. "Old, hungry, tired of hiding from your kind." It raised Lisa's rifle and pointed it at me. "But this land remembers when my people hunted yours, when we took whatever shape we needed to survive." I dove to the side as it fired. The bullet whistled past my ear and sparked off a rock behind me. I rolled, came up running, and sprinted for the helicopter. Behind me, I heard pursuit. Not human footsteps, but the sound of something big moving on 4 legs. The helicopter was 50 yards away. I made it 30 before something hit me from behind, driving me face first into the tundra. Claws raked across my back, cutting through my jacket like paper. I rolled over and found myself staring up at a massive wolf, bigger than any animal that should exist. It had Lisa's golden eyes, but filled with an intelligence no wolf should possess. When it spoke, the words came out as growls and snarls, but somehow I understood them. "You taste afraid," it said. "Good. Fear makes the meat tender." I fumbled for my rifle, but the wolf thing put one huge paw on my chest and pressed down. Ribs cracked. The weight was enormous, like being crushed under a boulder. "I could end this quickly," it growled. "But I want you to understand something first. This is my land. Has been for longer than your people have had names for things. You're the invader here." Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. I was suffocating under its weight. With the last of my strength, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out something my grandfather had given me years ago. A small pouch of herbs and sage that he said would protect against evil spirits. I'd carried it as a good luck charm, never really believing. The wolf thing saw what I was holding and stepped back so fast it almost fell over. Its eyes went wide with something that looked like fear. "Where did you get that?" it snarled. I pulled myself to my feet, clutching the pouch. The creature backed away another step, lips pulled back from teeth the size of my fingers. "My grandfather," I gasped. "Gwich'in medicine. Impossible. We killed all the ones who knew the old ways." "You missed one." The wolf thing circled me, staying just out of reach. I could see it wanted to attack but didn't dare get close to the herbs. Its form began to shift and blur, changing from wolf to something more human-shaped, but still wrong. "This isn't over," it said in a voice like breaking ice. "I know your scent now. I'll follow you wherever you go." Then it turned and loped away across the tundra, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. Within minutes, it had disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Arctic. I stood there alone, holding my grandfather's medicine pouch and trying to figure out how to explain any of this in my report. I made it back to the helicopter and called for immediate evacuation. But by the time rescue arrived 6 hours later, I'd had time to think about what had happened. The thing wearing Lisa's face had known things about the land that went back centuries. It talked about its people like there had been others. Back at base, I spent 3 days going through old files and local records. What I found made my blood run cold. Reports going back to the 1,940 seconds of missing research teams, scattered over decades. Scientists, survey crews, hunters, all found dead in ways that didn't make sense. Torn apart by animals that left human tracks. Bodies that showed signs of being partially eaten, but not by any creature anyone could identify. The pattern was always the same. Teams would go missing during the caribou migration. They'd be found days later, killed in ways that suggested both human intelligence and animal savagery. The official reports blamed bear attacks or accidents, but reading between the lines, I could see the confusion of investigators who couldn't explain what they'd found. On the 4th day, I got a call from Jenny at base. "Sam, we've got another problem. The satellite photos show the caribou herd has split up completely. They're scattered across 300 square miles, running in all directions like they don't know where they are. Any sign of what's driving them? That's just it. There's nothing there. No predators we can spot, no disturbance to the environment. It's like they're running from something invisible." I knew what they were running from. The question was what I could do about it. My grandfather's medicine pouch had scared the creature off, but I didn't think it would work twice. It would be ready for that trick next time. I drove back out to the research camp, carrying every piece of traditional Gwich'in medicine I could find. Sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, herbs that had names and languages almost no one spoke anymore. If there was a way to fight this thing using old knowledge, I had to try. The camp looked different in daylight. The bodies had been removed, but dark stains marked the ground where they'd fallen. The scattered equipment told a story of sudden, overwhelming violence. But there was something else. Symbols scratched into the ground near the largest bloodstain. Not random marks, but deliberate patterns that hurt to look at directly. I was photographing the symbols when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, hand on my rifle, and saw what looked like one of the dead researchers walking toward me. Dr. Martinez, whose body I'd helped carry to the helicopter 4 days ago. "Hello? Samuel," it said in his voice. "I was hoping you'd come back." The face was perfect. Martinez's thin features, his graying beard, even the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. But the eyes were wrong. Too bright, too knowing. And when it moved, there was that same fluid grace I'd seen in the thing wearing Lisa's face. "You're not Martinez," I said. "No. But I know everything he knew. His memories, his fears, his love for his family back in California. I can be him perfectly." It came closer, hands open and unthreatening. "Do you know how long I've been alone out here?" "Centuries, Samuel. Taking what I need to survive, hiding from your kind, watching the world change around me. The loneliness is difficult. So you kill people. I take what I need. Your people do the same to the animals you hunt. How is this different?" I pulled out my grandfather's medicine pouch, and the creature stopped walking. Its face twisted with something like pain. "That won't work forever," it said. "The old medicine is strong, but I'm stronger, and I'm patient. I can wait for you to make a mistake. What do you want? To not be alone anymore. Your kind has spread across my hunting grounds. Soon there will be nowhere left for me to hide. So I've decided to stop hiding." The creature's form began to change. Martinez's familiar features melted and shifted, becoming something that was part human, part wolf, part something else entirely. When the transformation was complete, it stood 8 feet tall with 2 long arms ending in claws like black knives. "I'm going to take one of your settlements," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "Become everyone who lives there, a whole town full of me, spreading out across the world. No more hiding, no more hunger." It lunged at me with impossible speed. I dove to the side, rolling behind the remains of a research tent. Claws raked through the fabric inches from my head. I scrambled to my feet and ran, pulling out the sacred herbs as I moved. The creature followed, moving sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, always staying just close enough to keep me terrified. "You can't run forever," it called. "I know this land better than you know your own home." But I wasn't trying to run forever. I was heading for the river, where the water ran swift and clean. My grandfather had taught me that moving water could wash away evil, could purify things that had been corrupted. The creature caught up to me at the riverbank. I spun around and threw a handful of sage into its face. It recoiled, screaming in a voice that sounded like tearing metal. While it was distracted, I waded into the river. The water was ice cold, fed by glacial melt that had been frozen for thousands of years. It numbed my legs in seconds, but I kept moving toward the center where the current was strongest. "Come into the water," I shouted. "Face me here." The creature paced along the bank, snarling. "I don't need to fight you in the water, old man. I can wait until you freeze to death." But I wasn't planning to wait. I pulled out all the sacred herbs at once: sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, plants whose names I remembered from childhood stories, and held them high above my head. "Grandfather," I said in Gwich'in, using words he'd taught me but I'd never thought I'd need. "Help me send this thing back to whatever dark place it came from." The creature laughed. "Your grandfather is dead. His medicine died with him." I lit the herbs with my emergency lighter. They caught fire despite being damp from the river spray, burning with a clean, white flame that seemed brighter than it should have been. The creature stopped laughing. Its form began to waver and blur like heat haze. "No," it said, voice fading. "This is my land, my hunting ground." "Not anymore." I threw the burning herbs toward the bank where it stood. The creature tried to dodge, but the smoke followed it, wrapping around its shifting form like chains. Where the smoke touched, pieces of it began to dissolve. "I'll come back," it screamed as it faded. "When the herds return, I'll be waiting. Then we'll be ready," I said. The The smoke cleared. The creature was gone. On the riverbank, scattered across the ground, were pieces of skin from a dozen different animals, signed, and something that might have been human flesh. All of it was already rotting in the midnight sun. I made it back to base 3 days later, half frozen and completely exhausted. The official report I filed was carefully edited. Equipment failure, animal attacks, tragic accidents. The kind of paperwork that would satisfy the bureaucrats without raising questions I couldn't answer. But I wrote another report, too. One that went into the tribal council files, written in Gwich'in and English both. A record of what really happened, in case something like this ever came back. Because I knew it would come back. Things like that don't stay dead, they just wait. And the Arctic is a patient place, where winters last for months and summers barely warm the ground. 6 months later, the caribou herds returned to their traditional migration routes. The animals seemed calmer, moving with their ancient rhythm, instead of the panicked chaos I'd seen that August. But I noticed they still avoided certain areas. Places where the ground was stained, dark, and the grass grew in strange patterns. I requested a transfer to a different part of the refuge the following spring. Officially, I wanted experience in new territory. Unofficially, I couldn't stand being in places where I might catch a glimpse of something that looked familiar but moved wrong. The new rangers who took over the Canning River Station were good people. Experienced, careful, respectful of the land. I made sure they carried sage and sweetgrass in their field kits, told them it was traditional protection against bears. They humored me, thinking it was just the superstition of an old ranger who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe what I saw that August was just stress and isolation playing tricks on my mind. The Arctic can do that to people, make them see things that aren't there, believe in shadows that are just wind through grass. But on quiet nights, when the wind carries sounds from the tundra, I still hear something that might be howling. Something that starts animal and becomes almost human before fading into the vast silence of the north. And sometimes, reading reports from other wildlife refuges across Alaska, I find familiar patterns. Research teams gone missing during animal migrations. Bodies found torn apart in ways that don't quite make sense. Tracks that change from human to animal and back again. The thing wearing Martinez's face had talked about not wanting to be alone anymore, about spreading out across the world. I keep those reports in a special file, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, just in case. The Gwich'in elders nod when I tell them these stories. Old hunger walks again, they say. But the old medicine still works, if people remember how to use it. I'm teaching the younger rangers everything my grandfather taught me, disguising lessons about spiritual protection as wilderness safety training. Some of them think I'm just an old man telling scary stories. Others listen with the kind of attention that tells me they've seen things they can't explain. The caribou know. They remember. Every year during migration season, I watch them with binoculars from ranger stations scattered across their route. Most of the time, they move like they always have, following paths worn by countless generations, stopping at rivers they've crossed for thousands of years. But sometimes they bunch up and run, fleeing from empty ground toward horizons that promise safety. And on those days, I make sure every ranger in the refuge carries sage and sweetgrass, whether they believe in its power or not. Because the Arctic remembers everything. The permafrost holds secrets that are older than human memory, and sometimes those secrets wake up hungry. My name is Samuel Icevein, and I've been watching the wilderness for 20 years now. I know what's out there in the places where the maps end and the modern world hasn't quite reached. And I know it's still watching us. My name is Rebecca Stormtide, and for 12 years I kept the waters of Glacier Bay National Park safe. I was a ranger who didn't believe in sea monsters. That was my first mistake. September 1985 was supposed to be routine. The king salmon were running, the tourists had mostly gone home, and I had my patrol boat ready for another day of checking on the fishing boats that still worked these cold Alaskan waters. At 34, I thought I'd seen everything the sea could throw at me. After 6 years in the Coast Guard and a marine biology degree, the ocean held no mysteries for me anymore. I was wrong about that too. The morning started normal enough. Coffee black as crude oil, radio chatter from the harbor master, and the familiar smell of salt and diesel that meant home to me. My patrol boat, The Times Tidewatch asterisk cut through the gray waters of Muir Inlet like she always did. The glaciers towered above us, white and blue and ancient, dropping chunks of ice the size of cars into the water with sounds like thunder. "Base, this is Ranger Stormtide," I said into my radio. "Starting morning patrol of Muir Inlet. Weather's calm, visibility good." "Copy that, Rebecca," came the voice of dispatch. "Be advised, we've got a fishing vessel overdue from yesterday." The Times Northern Spirit asterisk. 8 crew aboard. They were working the salmon runs near the glacier face. I felt the first cold touch of worry in my chest. Boats went missing sometimes, engine trouble, radio failure, navigation errors. But the Times Northern Spirit Times was captained by Jim Morrison, and Jim had been fishing these waters for 20 years. He knew every current, every hidden rock, every dangerous ice flow. "Any last known position?" I asked. "They checked in yesterday around 1600 hours, said they were setting nets near Riggs Glacier." That's the last we heard. I turned the Times Tidewatch Times toward the northern arm of the inlet, where Riggs Glacier dropped its ancient ice into the sea. The water here was deeper, colder, and full of floating icebergs that could crush a boat if you weren't careful. But Jim Morrison was always careful. The first thing I found was wrong. Floating on the water, about 2 miles from the glacier, was a piece of metal. Not just any piece. It was part of the Times Northern Spirit's Times hull, but it was folded. Folded like someone had taken a sheet of paper and creased it in half. The metal was 2 inches thick. You'd need a hydraulic press to fold steel like that. I pulled it aboard and stared at it. The metal was cold, colder than it should be, even in these waters, and there were marks on it, not scratches or scrapes like you'd get from rocks or ice. These marks were round, about 6 inches across, and they went deep into the steel. They looked like sucker marks. I radioed back to base. "I've found wreckage from the Times Northern Spirit asterisk. But something's not right here." "What do you mean not right?" I looked at the folded metal again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "The hull has been compressed, like it was squeezed." There was a long pause. "Squeezed? By what?" That was the question, wasn't it? What could squeeze a 40-foot fishing boat like a tin can? I'd seen boats hit by icebergs, boats caught in storms, boats that ran onto rocks. This was different. This was impossible. But the evidence was right there in my hands. I spent the rest of the morning searching the area, finding more pieces of the Times Northern Spirit asterisk. All of them showed the same impossible compression. The boat had been crushed by something with incredible strength, something that grabbed it and squeezed until the steel gave way. The worst part was what I didn't find. 8 men had been on that boat. 8 good men with families back in Juneau. There was no sign of them anywhere. No bodies, no life preservers, no personal belongings. It was like they had simply vanished when the boat was destroyed. As I searched, I noticed other things. The water here was wrong. It was too cold, even for Alaska. My thermometer showed temperatures that should have been impossible this time of year. And the ice. There were icebergs here that didn't match the glacier they should have come from. They were darker, stranger, and they had shapes that made no sense. The whales were gone too. Humpbacks usually fed in these waters during salmon season, but I hadn't seen a single one all morning. The sea was empty of life, like everything with sense had fled. By afternoon, I had to accept the truth. The Times Northern Spirit Times was gone, crushed by something I couldn't understand. 8 good men were dead or missing, and I had no explanation to give their families. I headed back to base with a bag full of impossible evidence and a growing certainty that something was very wrong in Glacier Bay. That night, I sat in my small apartment looking out at the water. The Tlingit people who lived here before us had stories about these waters. Stories about things that lived in the deep places, things that were older than the ice itself. I'd always dismissed those stories as superstition. But superstition doesn't fold steel like paper. 3 days later, I wasn't alone anymore. Dr. Carl Seastar had driven up from the University of Alaska with a truck full of equipment and a head full of theories. He was younger than me, maybe 30, with the kind of excitement that comes from thinking you're about to make a discovery that will get you tenure. "The sonar readings are fascinating," he said, setting up his underwater cameras on the Times Tidewatch asterisk. "We're getting returns from something massive moving under the glacier. Something big enough to show up as a solid contact at depths of 600 feet. I watched him work, checking his instruments and adjusting his cameras. How big are we talking? 400 feet long minimum. Maybe bigger. The sonar can't get a clear reading because of the ice distortion. But whatever it is, it's enormous. 400 feet. That was longer than the biggest whale. Longer than most ships. I thought about the folded metal in my evidence bag and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. We headed out into the inlet just after dawn. The water was glass smooth, reflecting the mountains and glaciers like a mirror. It was the kind of beautiful morning that made you forget Alaska could kill you if you weren't careful. "Drop the hydrophones here," Seastar said when we reached the area where I'd found the wreckage. "If there's something down there, we'll hear it." The hydrophones went down on long cables, sensitive microphones that could pick up sounds from miles away underwater. Seastar put on headphones and listened while I kept watch on the surface. For an hour, we heard nothing but the normal sounds of the sea. Ice cracking, distant waves, the hum of our own engine. Then Seastar went rigid. "Rebecca, you need to hear this." He handed me the headphones, and I listened to the sounds from deep beneath our boat. At first, it was just whale song, the long, haunting calls that humpbacks use to communicate across vast distances. But there was something wrong with it. The calls were too deep, too complex, and underneath them was something else. Voices. Human voices, mixed with the whale song like some impossible duet. "That's not possible," I whispered. "No," Seastar agreed. "It's not." The voices were speaking, but not in English. The words were old, flowing like water, rising and falling with the whale song, until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I'd heard Tlingit elders speak the old language, and this was similar, but different. Older, deeper. Then the whale song stopped. The sudden silence was so complete it was like being struck deaf. No sound came through the hydrophones, not even the normal background noise of the ocean. For 30 seconds, we floated in absolute quiet. When the sound came back, it wasn't whale song. It was something else singing, something with a voice like grinding ice and deep water. The song was beautiful and terrible at the same time, filling the headphones with sounds that made my bones ache. And underneath it, barely audible, were the voices of the missing fishermen. They were calling for help. Seastar yanked the hydrophones up so fast he nearly broke the cables. His face was white, and his hands were shaking. "We need to get closer to the glacier," he said. "Are you insane?" "We just heard." "We heard proof," he interrupted. "Proof that something incredible is down there. Something that science has never documented." I stared at him. "We heard 8 dead men singing with some kind of monster. That's not science, Carl. That's horror." But he was already moving, adjusting his equipment, preparing his cameras. The academic in him had taken over, and he couldn't see past his excitement to the danger we were in. I should have turned the boat around right then. I should have radioed for help, called in the Coast Guard, done anything but what I did. Instead, I started the engine and headed toward the glacier. The water near Riggs Glacier was full of floating ice, chunks ranging from the size of refrigerators to the size of houses. I had to pilot carefully, threading between the icebergs while Seastar deployed his underwater cameras. The massive face of the glacier rose above us like a blue-white wall, creaking and groaning as it pushed toward the sea. "Cameras at 200 feet, Seastar reported. 300, 400. On his monitor, we could see the dark water beneath us, lit by the camera's lights. The bottom was invisible, lost in the depths, but the lights revealed shapes moving in the darkness. Large shapes that stayed just at the edge of the illumination. 500 feet, 600. The camera stopped descending. Seastar frowned and checked his controls. "Something's wrong. The cable should have more length." On the monitor, something moved in front of the camera. Something pale and huge, sliding through the water with impossible grace. For just a moment, I saw what looked like a human arm, but the arm was 20 feet long and pale as glacier ice. Then a tentacle, thick as a tree trunk and covered in suckers the size of dinner plates, wrapped around the camera cable. "Pull it up," I said. "Pull it up now." Seastar was frozen, staring at the monitor as more tentacles appeared in the light. They were examining the camera, touching it with a curiosity that was almost human. In the background, barely visible in the camera's glow, I could see the outline of something massive, something that dwarfed our boat like a whale dwarfs a fish. "Carl, pull up the camera," He reached for the controls, but it was too late. The tentacles yanked the camera down into the darkness so fast the cable snapped. On the monitor, we watched the camera tumble through the black water until the light disappeared completely. The boat rocked suddenly, hit by a wave that came from nowhere. Then another. Something was rising from the depths, displacing water as it came up toward us. "Start the engine," Seastar whispered. I was already trying, but the engine wouldn't catch. The boat rocked again, harder this time, and a sound came up from the water around us. The same terrible singing we'd heard through the hydrophones. But now it was everywhere, coming from all directions at once. The water next to the boat turned black as something massive passed beneath us. I caught a glimpse of pale flesh sliding by, too big to comprehend. One tentacle broke the surface 50 yards away, rising up like a pale tree before disappearing back into the depths. The engine finally caught, and I gunned it toward open water. Behind us, the singing grew louder, joined by voices that I was starting to recognize. Jim Morrison's voice, Eddie Kowalski from the Times Northern Spirit *, all 8 of the missing fishermen, calling out from somewhere beneath the waves. We didn't speak until we were back in safe water, miles from the glacier. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Seastar looked at me with eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Did you see it?" he whispered. "Did you see the size of that thing?" I had seen it. I'd seen enough to know that everything I thought I knew about the ocean was wrong. Something lived in the deep water near the glaciers, something so big and so impossible that my mind could barely accept it. And it had the voices of 8 dead men. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment with a bottle of whiskey and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those voices calling from beneath the waves. Not just the fishermen, but something else. Something that sang in a language older than human speech. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going to find that thing and figure out what it wanted. Carl was waiting for me at the harbor, loading fresh equipment onto his research vessel, Times Deep Explorer *. He looked like he hadn't slept either, but his excitement was undiminished. "I've been thinking about the vocalizations," he said, as we headed out. "The way it seemed to mimic human speech. That suggests an intelligence level far beyond anything we've documented in cephalopods." "It's not mimicking," I told him. "Those were the voices of the men from the Times Northern Spirit *. Don't you understand? That thing has them." He paused in his work. "Rebecca, that's impossible. Sound doesn't work that way." "Nothing about this is possible, Carl. But we're going back anyway." This time, we brought more equipment. Stronger cameras, longer cables, and emergency flares in case we needed to signal for help. I also brought my grandfather's rifle. Not that bullets would do much good against something that size, but it made me feel better. The water near the glacier was different today. Colder, darker, and full of ice that moved in patterns that defied the current. As we approached the area where we'd lost the camera, the temperature dropped so fast that our breath misted in the air. "Sonar contact," Carl announced. "Something big, moving up from the deep." I looked at the sonar screen and felt my blood turn cold. The contact was huge, rising toward us like an underwater mountain, but it was moving too fast to be anything natural. "How deep?" I asked. 800 feet, 700. "It's coming up fast." The water around the boat began to churn. Not waves, something else. The sea itself was moving, swirling in a pattern that centered directly beneath us. In the middle of the swirl, the water was turning black. 600 feet, 500. I started the engine and began backing away from the disturbance, but the black water followed us. Whatever was down there wasn't just rising, it was hunting us. 400 feet, 300. The singing started again, but this time it came from the water around the boat. The voices of the Times Northern Spirit's Times crew, calling to us from beneath the waves. But now there were other voices too. Older voices, speaking in the ancient language we'd heard before. 200 feet, 100. "Carl, we need to go, now." But he was leaning over the side of the boat, staring into the black water with scientific fascination. "Look at the phosphorescence patterns. It's using bioluminescence to communicate." The water was glowing now, pale green lights swirling in patterns that hurt to look at. And in the center of the lights, something was rising, something pale and massive and impossible. It broke the surface like a mountain emerging from the sea. The first thing I saw was an eye. One enormous eye. blue-black as deep water and bigger than our entire boat. The eye focused on us with an intelligence that was alien and ancient and completely aware. Then came the tentacles. They rose from the water around us, each one thick as a redwood tree and longer than a city block. The suckers that lined them were the size of truck tires, and they moved with a grace that was beautiful and terrifying. But the worst part was the torso. Rising from the center of the tentacles was something that might once have been human. It was pale as glacier ice and massive beyond comprehension, with arms that ended in hands the size of cars. The face was human in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too large, too ancient, too knowing. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of ice breaking and deep water moving. "You have disturbed the feeding grounds," it said, and the words came from everywhere at once. From the creature, from the water, from the voices of the dead fishermen. "You have taken what was not yours to take." Carl was standing at the edge of the boat, completely transfixed. "Incredible," he whispered. "A cephalopod with human characteristics. The evolutionary implications." A tentacle rose from the water and wrapped around his waist with gentle precision. He didn't even struggle as it lifted him from the boat. "Carl!" I grabbed for him, but he was already out of reach. The creature held him up to its massive face, studying him with that enormous eye. When Carl spoke, his voice was calm, almost dreamy. "The neural complexity required for speech," he said. "The cognitive development necessary for abstract thought. You're magnificent." The creature listened to him with something like curiosity. Then it began to sing. The song was the same terrible beauty we'd heard before, but now I understood what it was. It was a hunting song, ancient and primal, the sound of something that had ruled these waters since before humans learned to build boats. As it sang, Carl's expression changed. The scientific excitement faded, replaced by something else, something dreamy and distant. His eyes grew unfocused, and when he spoke again, his voice harmonized with the creature's song. "The salmon runs have been disturbed," he said, but the words weren't his anymore. "The ice melts too quickly. The old ways are forgotten." The creature nodded, a gesture so human it was more terrifying than anything else I'd seen. Then it lowered Carl toward the water, and I knew I was about to lose him. I grabbed the flare gun and fired it directly at the creature's eye. The flare exploded in a burst of red light, and the creature recoiled with a sound like a glacier calving. It dropped Carl into the water and sank beneath the surface, taking its terrible song with it. I hauled Carl aboard, and we fled toward open water while the sea boiled behind us. He was unconscious but breathing, his skin cold as ice, and his lips blue with hypothermia. It wasn't until we reached the harbor that he woke up. When he did, he looked at me with eyes that weren't quite his own anymore. "It showed me things, Rebecca," he whispered. "Things about these waters, about what's coming." "What did you see?" "The ice is melting, the old feeding grounds are changing, and it's hungry, so very, very hungry." He closed his eyes and began to hum. The same tune the creature had sung, the ancient hunting song of something that had ruled these waters long before humans ever arrived. I knew then that Carl was lost to me, just like the fisherman from the Times Northern Spirit asterisk. The creature had touched his mind, and part of him would always belong to it now. But at least I understood what we were dealing with. This wasn't just some unknown species of giant squid. This was something older, something that remembered when the glaciers first formed and would still be here when they melted away completely. And it was angry that we had disturbed its ancient domain. I spent that night researching everything I could find about the old stories. The Tlingit called it Hishki, the glacial sea demon. According to their legends, it had lived in these waters since the ice first came down from the mountains. It was a guardian spirit, protector of the salmon runs and keeper of the old ways. But something had changed. The elders I spoke to were frightened in a way I'd never seen before. They talked about the ice melting too fast, the salmon runs changing, the old balance being destroyed. "Hishki is angry," old Mary Little Wolf told me. "The ice spirits are dying, and the sea demon feels their pain. It will not let the salmon grounds be disturbed while they suffer." "What does it want?" "Respect," she said simply. "Recognition of the old agreements. Your people have forgotten the proper ways." She was right. For generations, the Tlingit had fished these waters according to ancient traditions. They took only what they needed, gave thanks for what they received, and left offerings for the spirits that ruled the sea. But the commercial fishermen didn't follow those traditions. They took what they wanted without thought for the consequences. And now something ancient and powerful was making them pay. The next morning brought a storm unlike any I'd seen. The wind came from all directions at once, and the waves moved in patterns that defied physics. But the strangest thing was the ice. Despite the warm September weather, new icebergs were forming in the bay. Large ones, blue-black and strange, that sang with voices when the wind blew through them. I took the Tidewatch Times out alone, carrying the traditional offerings Mary Little Wolf had prepared for me. Salmon, cedar bark, and tobacco. Gifts for a spirit that ruled the sea. The creature was waiting for me at the glacier. It rose from the water like a pale mountain, tentacles spread wide, and that enormous eye focused on my small boat. But this time, it didn't attack. It simply watched as I approached, its alien intelligence weighing my intentions. "I've brought offerings," I called out, my voice small against the sound of wind and ice. "Gifts for Hishki, guardian of the salmon grounds." The creature tilted its massive head, listening. I threw the salmon into the water, one by one, speaking the words Mary Little Wolf had taught me. Words in the old language, asking permission to fish the traditional waters, promising respect for the ancient ways. As I spoke, the creature began to sing. Not the terrible hunting song this time, but something softer. Something that sounded like grief and loss and anger at the changing world. Then it spoke, and its voice carried the pain of centuries. "The ice dies," it said. "The salmon paths change. Your kind takes without giving, destroys without thought. The old agreements are broken." "I know," I said. "But some of us remember. Some of us want to make it right." The creature studied me with that enormous eye, and I felt its ancient mind touching mine. For a moment, I saw what it saw, the glaciers retreating, the water warming, the salmon runs disrupted by boats and nets, and the careless greed of people who had forgotten that the sea was not theirs to own. "You will speak for the old ways?" it asked. "I will try." The creature nodded slowly. Then it began to sink back into the depths, its tentacles disappearing beneath the black water. But before it vanished completely, it spoke one more time. "The salmon grounds are closed," it said, "until your kind remembers respect." And then it was gone, leaving me alone on the water with the sound of breaking ice and the knowledge that everything had changed. When I returned to shore, I found Carl waiting for me. He looked more like himself now, though his eyes still held echoes of the creature's ancient song. "It let you go," he said. "It accepted the offering, for now." He nodded. "I've been thinking about what it showed me. The neural pathways, the cognitive structures. It's not just intelligent, Rebecca. It's been learning from every mind it's touched. All those fishermen, all those voices, they're part of it now." The thought chilled me. What does that mean? It means it understands us better than we understand ourselves. It knows our weaknesses, our fears, our capacity for destruction. And it's decided we're a threat that needs to be contained. He was right. The creature wasn't just defending its territory. It was protecting the ocean itself from the damage humans could cause. And if that meant keeping us away with fear and death, it would do whatever was necessary. The fishing restrictions went into effect immediately. The entire Muir Inlet was declared off-limits to commercial fishing indefinitely. The official reason was environmental protection, but those of us who knew the truth understood the real cause. Hishki was keeping its word. Over the following months, the marine life began to return to normal. The whales came back to their feeding grounds, the salmon runs stabilized, and the water temperature returned to seasonal averages. But there were still signs that something ancient and powerful watched from the depths. Fishermen reported glimpses of massive shapes moving beneath their boats. Children playing on the beaches found strange shells that sang when the wind blew through them. And sometimes, on very clear days, you could see icebergs in the deep water that moved against the current and glowed with their own pale light. I worked with Mary Little Wolf and the other Tlingit elders to establish new protocols for the waters around Glacier Bay. Traditional offerings at the start of each salmon season. Limits on the number of boats that could enter the sacred waters. Respect for the old ways that had kept the balance for thousands of years. Carl eventually returned to his university, but he was changed. His research now focused on the intelligence of marine life, the complex social structures of cephalopods, and the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. He never published his findings about what we'd encountered in Glacier Bay. Some discoveries, he said, weren't meant to be shared with the world. I stayed in Alaska, continuing my work as a ranger, but with a new understanding of what I was protecting. The ocean wasn't just a body of water filled with fish and whales. It was home to things older and wiser than humanity. Creatures that remembered when the world was young and would endure long after we were gone. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the aurora dances across the water, I think about Hishki resting in the deep places beneath the ice. I wonder if it dreams, and what those dreams might contain. The voices of lost fishermen, the songs of whales that swam these waters before humans ever built their first boats, or perhaps visions of a future where the ice melts completely and ancient things rise from trenches that have been dark for millennia. I know now that the ocean keeps its own counsel. It has its own guardians, its own justice, and its own way of dealing with those who forget their place in the natural order. The Tlingit understood this. They knew that the sea was not empty water waiting to be exploited, but a living entity deserving of respect. Hishki taught me that some boundaries should never be crossed, some waters should remain sacred, and some creatures should be left alone in the depths where they belong, guardians of secrets too old and terrible for the surface world to understand. The salmon runs continue, the glaciers still drop their ancient ice into the sea, and somewhere far below, something vast and patient watches over it all. The old agreements hold, maintained by offerings and respect, and the understanding that humanity is not the only intelligence in the world. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the water is still, you can hear it singing in the depths. The song of ice and deep water, and things that remember when the world was different than it is now. The Leviathan of Glacier Bay sleeps, but it does not forget. And it will rise again if the old ways are abandoned, if the salmon grounds are disturbed, or if anyone is foolish enough to believe that the ocean belongs to them alone. I know this because I've heard its voice in my dreams, calling across the dark water in a language older than human speech. A reminder that some forces in nature are beyond our understanding or control. And wisdom lies in respecting what we cannot comprehend. The sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you listen carefully, it will teach you the most important lesson of all, that we are visitors in this world, not its masters, and our survival depends on remembering the difference. In Glacier Bay, the ice sings and the deep water dreams, and ancient things still guard the pathways of the salmon. The balance holds, fragile as morning frost, maintained by respect and offerings and the knowledge that some powers are older than human ambition. And in the depths, Hishki waits, patient as stone, eternal as ice, ready to rise again if the old agreements are broken or the sacred waters are defiled. The ocean remembers everything, it forgives nothing, and it protects what matters most, regardless of the cost to those who would disturb the ancient peace.